Welcome, welcome to our attendees. It's really good to have you here. Please feel free to say hi in the chat to everyone. It would be really good to hear your name, your company, and where you're logging in from. Thanks so much. We'll just wait a couple more minutes. Thank you all. Welcome, welcome. Please do say hi in the chat function. Give us your name and your company and where you're logging in from. I would ask for a weather report, but I don't want to feel even more miserably cold than I already do. So I don't want to hear if you're very warm right now. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to say your name wrong, but Durga, I think Mauritius probably gives us the picture we don't need right now in this cold, but thank you so much. It's really good to have you here. And Georgina, Sunny, Monique, we're with you, rainy Cape Town. Thanks so much all. I think we're going to kick off with this webinar while we have further attendees joining. We really do appreciate your time in this very busy season. Today we're focusing on LCA as a tool to evaluate single-use plastic products in South Africa. And we have a range of different experts here to present to you and to guide us in the application of LCA with very specific reference to our mandatory EPR scheme. So I'll leave the lineup on screen while we just start with our welcome. So thank you so much. We want to consider today the wise use of LCAs in guiding packaging choices and even business models with a focus on single-use plastic products. We thank our experts on this webinar for giving of your time and expertise to guide us on this important and useful tool that is now also part of our mandatory EPR system and is included in our new EPR regulations. I'm Kirsten from Green Cape and the project lead on the SA Plastics Pact. And I'm very ably assisted by Oliver Bonstein and Dashanya Naidu today from the Green Cape team. So first up, while Peter starts to share his screen, we have Peter Manyara of the IUCN. Peter is IUCN's marine plastic lead in the Eastern and Southern African region and the program manager for coastal and ocean resilience in South Africa, where he oversees the implementation of the Marine Plastics and Coastal Communities Initiative, MarPlastics. Thank you, Dee. You can stop sharing now. He previously worked with UNEP's Global Initiative on Marine Litter at its infancy, where he supported efforts to establish a global framework for strengthening regional and national mechanisms to address marine litter around the world. Thank you so much for being here, Peter. Please give us an overview of your current focus.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. So today I'll be talking about LCAs, but from a perspective of plastics hotspotting. So to jump straight into my presentation, the slides are now moving. Yeah, so a lot will be said today about the life cycle assessment, the well-known methodology, environmental assessment methodology. So I won't really dwell on that. My focus on this slide will be to highlight the IUCN publication that you see on the left that looked at different existing and emerging methodologies, including LCA that aim to address plastic pollution at different scales. So some of the key findings from this publication that was released 2 years ago are that LCA was originally developed to assess impacts of land-based industries and mostly on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. And so there was a good acknowledgement among the LCA community that the impacts generated by marine debris were not really adequately addressed within LCA. So the diagram you see on the right side shows how plastic is tackled within LCA, which is mostly the production to the middle part, but then the missing pathway for plastic losses through a company or product or maybe the different services that are offered was generally lacking. So that was the missing pathway that we got interested in. So the other observation we made was that where LCAs considered waste management scenarios, they normally ignored environmental leakage of packaging. And so broadly also, the other aspect is, maybe with the exception of South Africa and a few other countries, a lot of countries really lack the data that allow for impact assessment and to embed plastic impacts within LCA frameworks. So I think on that, South Africa could be doing a bit better than others. Though I think on the positive side, some of the methodologies we looked at are now starting to integrate plastics as a key pollutant, because previously, I think LCA looked at the collection of plastic waste streams that they either go to landfills, incineration, or recycling. And so the findings for us highlighted the need to use a metrics-based methodology based on leakage inventory, rather than just using a methodology that focuses mostly on recycling rates, and also a methodology that includes fate in their calculations. So based on the skills of various LCA experts out there, especially working in EA, Environmental Action in Europe, and Quantis, some big consulting organizations, and coupled with our interest on the pathways related to macro and micro plastics that reach the ocean and affect marine ecosystems in different ways. And this pathway, we noted, wasn't really adequately covered in any published methodology at the time. That was in 2019. So UNEP, through its life cycle initiative, and IUCN embarked on a journey to develop a methodology that acknowledges and recognizes that inventory methodologies are required to assess the quantities of plastic used, wasted, and leaked into the environment, an essential first stage in calculating a plastic footprint. So we developed a national guidance for plastic pollution hotspotting and shaping action, which from our perspective was quite holistic in that it addresses all different types of leakages, including mismanaged waste that you can see on the chart on the left, primary microplastics, accidentally lost plastics, different types of polymers and products, and even applications and sectors. And then it's also systemic in terms of how it helps different stakeholders to develop a systemic approach to solving the plastic pollution problem, e.g. by at least enabling the targeting of a particular polymer or application. And then it's also actionable in that it also guides users through a reproducible workflow with the necessary computational tools and modules to undertake like a comprehensive data collection, diagnosis, planning, and also implementation. So I'll conclude by saying that LCA can complement hotspotting results by providing more comprehensive impact analysis, especially where we have good data. And you'll hear a lot more about this in upcoming presentation. So just to look at the specific slide, I'll be sharing on the chat the link to this particular report on plastic hotspotting in South Africa. So Kirsten, with that, thank you very much. It was fairly brief.
Thank you so much, Peter. We really appreciate your input, and thank you so much for that fantastic work that you've just pointed out to us again. So please, if you haven't engaged with the IUCN hotspotting work, please do engage with it in the link that Peter is providing. So thank you so much. So Peter will stop sharing now, and we welcome Dumisani Buthelezi of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. Dumisani, we know your department is particularly busy at the moment with the new mandatory EPR system, and we really do appreciate your time. So both the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and the IUCN are very valuable supporting members of the South African Plastics Pact. So Dumisani is currently the Director for General Waste Minimization, and in his previous lives, he's been part of the green industry sector at the DTIC. As such, his work included the management of the National Clean Air Production Center, industrial energy efficiency, waste management, renewable energy, and water efficiency. In 2015, Dumi left the DTIC and joined Pick It Up, the waste management company of the city of Johannesburg, and he served as the specialist for SMME support under the waste minimization business area until late 2016. So once again, we have an expert in a range of different sectors and perspectives. Thank you so much, Jimmy. We welcome you to set the scene for us in LCA in South Africa related to our EPR regs.
Thank you so much, Chairperson, and thank you to everyone in the platform. I think I want to start by thanking all organizations, particularly UNEP, for extending the interest to present on the latest publications around LCA in South Africa. That is much appreciated. But we also want to thank the work that is being done through the Plastic Pact, the IUCN, and other organizations that are part of our program on plastics intervention. So, Chairperson, I'd like to emphasize the concept of cooperative governance, that when you look at how we're handling policies going forward now, maybe dating back from 20 years, I would say, especially in this space, we've emphasized that the participation of all sectors, especially those that are affected, it's quite critical in ensuring that we move together to develop policies that respond to the real societal issues. And I therefore want to applaud the participation of the South African industry and other organizations in ensuring that we have policies in place through government that really put South Africa on a map with regards, for example, to the extended producer responsibility and other policies that relate to waste management. Therefore, Chairperson, it's quite interesting for us that we are now talking about extended producer responsibility. It's been a pipe dream for a lot of time, for a very long time. And we were happy to have started the process in the past 2 years, if I may say. And we are excited, and we've seen the excitement on the part of the industry. We've had numerous extensive discussions on what is already on the public now, the notices on EPR and the regulations as well. We believe that this is a learning process for all of us in government, industry, and NGOs, but it also provides our counterparts in the African continent to also learn from our experiences going forward. Now, Chairperson, why I am emphasizing, or rather talking about EPR, it's because that is where the LCA requirement is embedded, especially on the regulations. We've emphasized on that mainly because when you look at the targets, there's a space where we talk about product life cycle. We therefore believe that the LCA could be, it's in fact one of the methodologies or approaches that could be used to achieve some of to help the industry and government achieve some of the targets, especially that relate to product life cycle. It's still a new concept for everyone that is involved with the EPR. I think this was raised on numerous occasions in the task team with industry and government. We therefore believe that this workshop would actually try and highlight some of the do's and don'ts and some of the opportunities that we could work towards in ensuring that we achieve the best goals that we could do. What we did now from the department side was to extend the year of commitment by the industry to do LCA, because we realize that we still need to introduce ourselves to a wide range of issues that underpin the LCA itself as a process, but also to case studies in different parts of the world. There were also concerns, colleagues, around the cost that is involved in developing these LCAs. We believe that all these things, through these engagements, all those questions would be clarified and would find a way with the industry to at least look at the low-hanging fruit in trying to make sure that LCA becomes part of our EPR policy going forward. We therefore thank the PROs and the producers that are continuing to register with the department. I think for paper and packaging, by yesterday we were sitting at 19, the number of people who have registered, or organizations that have registered with the department. And these are the groups that would be working with to establish the requirements for LCA, because we've realized that we can't do it as the department alone. But in this process, because it's a learning process, if you don't get it right from the onset, there will be a lot of back and forths. So we really need to start talking with the industry as soon as the process of registration is done. And then we could then all agree on how this LCA would assist us. So we're therefore looking at this workshop today as a learning opportunity for the country. And we believe there would be more of similar workshops or learning opportunities going forward as we try to shape the policy to respond to what we all want to see in as far as the management of waste in the country is concerned. Without taking so much time, Chairperson, I'd like to thank you. I'll end here for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dumisani. We really appreciate your time. And thank you for highlighting that we're on this learning journey together. And we are here, therefore, as part of this webinar to co-design a way forward. So there are going to be some recommendations by the end of the webinar in terms of the way forward for South Africa. Please do add your voice. And this will be taken up in other workshops, primarily through the DFFE. But I think there is great potential for leadership here in this space. And I'd like to echo Dumisani's call to register with the department if you fall into the producer definition, that being the converter or packaging manufacturer, the brand owner, the retailer, or an importer. And therefore, as Dumisani mentioned, you will then be part of the conversation as we co-develop our mandatory EPR system. So thank you so much for your time, Dumisani. Next up, we'd love to welcome Llorenç Milà i Canals, who is the head of the Secretariat of the Life Cycle Initiative of the UN Environment Programme based in Paris. The Life Cycle Initiative is a multi-stakeholder partnership launched in 2002 and hosted by UNEP, with the aim of enabling the global use of credible life cycle knowledge by private and public decision makers. It currently joins the efforts of over 100 institutions, being governments, businesses, and science and civil society, as well as hundreds of individual experts that contribute to the improvement and sharing of life cycle knowledge and its use in policy and decision-making. For example, informing UNEA member states on the life cycle assessment perspectives on single-use plastic products and their alternatives. Llorenç works across teams in UNEP to embed the intelligence of life cycle systems thinking into programs such as the One Planet Network, the International Resource Panel, the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, etc., and key partnerships such as the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Llorenç also oversees the Global LCA Data Access Network. Thank you, Llorenç. We really appreciate your time, and we thank you for the expertise and the overview you're going to be sharing with us. I'd like to remind our attendees, please do feel free to place your questions in the Q&A function, and our experts will engage with you, and we'll also have a Q&A session. Thank you, Llorenç. We look forward to your presentation.
Many thanks, Kirsten, and many thanks all the organizers for inviting me to be here. It really is a big pleasure. And well, thanks for the introduction. I mean, it's yeah, that was humbling. I mean, thanks for all the presentations. I'll try to skip quickly through that part of the presentation, but essentially, as explained, I mean, the idea here today is to give some perspective of what UNEP sees as a way to apply life cycle approaches to solving plastics pollution, and particularly with a focus on single-use plastic products. So, well, I won't dwell in this slide because Kirsten already mentioned, and this is mainly to set the scene of where I work. So I work in UNEP leading the life cycle team. And one of the key initiatives that we've been working with in the last years is the Life Cycle Initiative that was launched almost 20 years ago to promote the use of life cycle thinking globally. So the vision that we have in the Life Cycle Initiative is that with life cycle thinking, we can contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and other relevant goals faster and more efficiently, because with life cycle thinking, we can target the key drivers for environmental impacts. And also we address potential trade-offs by looking at all potential impacts, both environmental and social as well, increasingly. So in order to do this, we are working mainly on these three areas that you see on technical and policy advice. And this is where really the rubber hits the road. This is where we're bringing life cycle tools to inform policies, to inform decision-making as well in the private sector. And we do that in a plethora of sectors, including plastics, and that's what we will be talking today. But in addition to that, of course, we're working more on the enabling conditions, both in terms of making sure that there is the right life cycle knowledge, the data, the impact assessment indicators, things like what Peter was mentioning before in terms of the approaches to assess the impacts of plastic litter in the environment. But in addition to this knowledge, there's also the capacity. So we're working as well a lot on developing the capacities worldwide. So if I can move to the next, if I manage. I've got this thing. There we go. So, well, certainly I don't think I need to focus or spend too much time on what the life cycle is, or the life cycle approach. If we take the definition, the life cycle is the consecutive and interlinked stages of a product system from raw material acquisition or generation from natural resources to the final disposal. So I will skip this quickly because I mean, of course, I think we're already aware in this audience. But I mean, essentially, what we've been looking at from a life cycle perspective is the collection of stages from the extraction of raw materials, the processing of these raw materials, the design and production of products, their distribution, and then finally the use and maintenance of the products so they deliver the service for which they're designed. And then finally, disposal or end of life or end of use. In the case of plastics, if we think of a plastic bottle, well, of course, this usually starts in oil and gas extraction to then the manufacturing of that plastic bottle that is then distributed and finally used and disposed of. We talk about the life cycle because even though if we look at the red arrows here, and maybe let me just use the pointer. But if we're looking at these red arrows, in fact, this system could be quite linear, and that's why we usually talk cradle to grave. So there's a beginning and an end. But in theory, we could also be closing this system with, for instance, recycling of the matter, or even reuse of the product. So if we make products to be reusable, we close the cycle much earlier, and that's why we talk about the life cycle. Of course, when we talk about plastics, the truth is that it's not that much of a cycle. We could talk about the plastics life arrow, because that's really where we see that the majority of what comes in is virgin material, and in terms of mass, most of it is actually just used once and then disposed of, discarded. A lot of it ending in the environment, as we know, but also in landfills, part of it as well being incinerated. And quite a small fraction of it is actually recycled back into the economy, although this is mainly only once, and then once this plastic has been used, most of it is actually again discarded. So these are the figures of one of the most cited references on what we know about the global flows of plastics by Roland Geyer, but also Jenna Jambek is in that list of authors. So this is roughly what we know, and what we know is that, yeah, the plastics life cycle is not so much of a cycle, but rather a linear system. And then to go into the context of why we're talking of a life cycle approach, and why do we believe this is important. These are some of the examples of requests that several international fora have been making, and here I'm focusing on the requests to UNEP and requests of member states, particularly, to look at the life cycle approach. And here we see, I mean, to begin with, in the SciChem process, the strategic approach to international chemicals management, where back, I think it was in 2007, they were kind of aiming at working on the life cycle management of chemicals present in products. And this was directly converted into the Sustainable Development Goal 12, which requests the sound management of chemicals and waste across their life cycle. And of course, this includes as well plastic and the chemicals within the plastic. Then in the United Nations Environment Assembly, we've seen several resolutions that request as well this life cycle approach. So I'm highlighting here some of the latest ones in the last full UNEA, which was UNEA 4 in March 2019. The first resolution on innovative approaches to sustainable consumption and production acknowledges that the use of life cycle approaches helps to ensure resource efficiency and reduced environmental impacts. Or that resolution 9, which we will see a bit more. So resolution 9 from UNEA 4 on addressing single-use plastic products pollution. It also encourages all the actors to promote the sound management of plastics across their life cycle. And maybe let me also add, I mean, the latest, which comes from yesterday. So this is really kind of the latest thing that we know. In the context of the Ministerial Conference on Marine Litter and Plastic Pollution that will happen in September, in the pre-meeting that was taking place yesterday, there was a request for UNEP to deliver the webinar that you can see on your screens, which will take place on the 12th of July at 2 p.m. East Africa time, so 1 p.m. in 1 p.m. in South Africa. Anyway, this is a webinar that will dwell a bit more into what a life cycle approach to plastics pollution can look like. And moving on, as we would like to save enough time for questions in the end, but we have been applying this kind of life cycle approaches, holistic, systemic approaches, in many different ways, and perhaps most successfully from UNEP, we've been preaching and promoting what we call the value chain approach. And the value chain, I mean, essentially looking at the whole life cycle, but not only at what happens physically to products and goods and services through the life cycle, but also who are the actors around this life cycle who generate or modify the value of products, which is what we call the value chain, which is a bit wider than the life cycle. And the key thing here is that we look at all these different steps, which can be converted into what we're doing in several sectors, starting from this assessment of the hotspots. So getting the facts right about what are the key hotspots, the key drivers of environmental impacts across the life cycle. And this is the basic thing. This is where we start based on robust science-based life cycle approaches. From the hotspots, then we work on identifying the potential solutions, always holistic solutions, taking into account all possible trade-offs and environmental impacts, and the solutions really across the life cycle. So from upstream, the design and production of the products, the midstream, when we're actually using the products or maintaining them, operating them, reusing them. And then finally downstream, which is obviously another important stage, but one in which not that much can already be done, apart from trying to control the damage. So the value chain approach also helps in identifying the actors across this value chain who need to be coordinated, and who are these actors that are best placed to deliver on the actions that have been identified. These actions also needs to be prioritized because we don't have the time or resources to do everything. So this prioritization of actions based on how we can achieve the biggest impact, how can we shift the needle on plastic pollution while at the same time addressing other environmental crises like nature loss or climate change. And in terms of prioritizing these actions, also it's important to agree on common goals, on a common agenda. Having everybody wanting to achieve this same agenda, these same goals, because that's also a way of being able to prioritize the actions. And importantly as well, in reaching these common goals, the monitoring and reporting processes are very important in order to keep everybody accountable, but also to keep everybody on their feet and kind of really pushing for the action. So this is overall the approach that that we're following. And then we will see some examples in the next slides of how we're doing this. And on this slide, this is a publication, a methodology that already was mentioned by Peter Maniara in the opening. So this methodology that the life cycle, that UNEP and the Life Cycle Initiative with IUCN and with the support, of course, of our knowledge partners in EA and Quantis, we developed this national guidance to do on assessing the hotspots on plastics pollution, but not just on assessing the hotspots, but then also to lead to the identification of the key actions, the key areas for intervention. So as Peter shared already, I mean, you can find all these guidance in the link, and not just the guidance, but also some of the reports for which that of the countries and regions that have already applied it with the support of IUCN. So we saw already the results for South Africa, which were published, I think, by the end of last year. And here we will not dwell on the results. I think there's other spaces as well to discuss what are these quantifications, but certainly, as Peter was saying, South Africa is in a relatively good place in terms of knowing the size of the problem, knowing the key areas, the key sectors, the key stages where this problem is being generated. And this is already an extraordinary starting point in order to be able to advance on the basis of solid data. So as mentioned, I will not dwell into a lot of these details about the numbers, but certainly, I mean, what we've identified, I mean, key numbers that we identified is what is the percentage of the plastic that is being collected, and then what happens with this plastic waste. I mean, how much of it is kind of mismanaged, perhaps going into uncontrolled landfills, or the part that leaks into the environment, the part that is finally recycled back into the economy. And then, well, what are the key products, the key polymers, the key applications that can be modified? So with this identification of hotspots, we would then look into potential actors, potential solutions, and this is just a not comprehensive list of some of the approaches, some of the solutions that we would see across the life cycle. So they are more or less organized across these life cycle stages that we were seeing before. Things like increasing recycled content, and this might be a key action, for instance, for material producers. Incorporating the recycled content means that we are actually closing the loop at this point. If there's no demand, it doesn't really matter that we recycle more and more, because nobody's taking that back into the economy. But then things that really affect the whole life cycle, like eco-design or circular design, we also see a key role for investors in financing for circular solutions. Certainly, the government has a strong role in many of the places. For instance, in increasing recycling rates, that's kind of, we see the responsibility of the government at the waste management, but of course, we need as well extended producer responsibility in order to facilitate, for instance, the financing of this recycling. And as we were seeing as well in the beginning by Dumisani, that using this EPR as well to influence, for instance, the costs that different producers need to pay, that kind of allows this modulation of the fees and promotes the incentives for eco-design products at the early stages, for eco-innovation, etc. Certainly promoting reuse models, where we see a strong role for obviously the producers who need to design and to shift their business models to reuse. But then the role of consumers, as we will see, is absolutely critical in ensuring that these that the reuse models actually work. So sustainable public procurement, also with the government as a key role as a consumer, promoting the right information for consumers through eco-labels and standards. So as you can see, there are a lot of actions across the life cycle. The idea is we have this big menu we can identify based on the hotspots and the realities of the country, which are the key actions and the key types of instruments that will work better in the country. So from identifying hotspots and promoting different types of solutions, in UNEP, we've also been providing and supporting the leadership and awareness raising on key actions that we have identified as some of the most relevant actions in order to transform the linear economy that we were seeing before for plastics into a system which is more circular. And on these, based on the many solutions that we've seen before, we selected among those solutions, and we co-designed together with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the new Plastics Economy Global Commitment. The global commitment is, as you know, led by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but in collaboration with UNEP. And in UNEP, we mainly provide the interface and the interaction with government. So that's why here we see a subset of the actions requested in the global commitment, the subset of actions for governments. These are among the actions, the ambitious actions that are being promoted in the global commitment to address the plastics value chain and pollution. However, the global commitment unites as well businesses, governments, and all the other actors. So these actions that we see here in terms of governments are just part of it. We also have specific actions for other actors in the value chain. And then all of these actions, of course, I should have said, are around this same vision that I'm sure you're all very familiar with about eliminating the plastics that are not needed, the plastic products that are not needed, innovating so the plastics that are needed remain in the economy and that they are actually designed to stay in the economy at their highest value, and then that we effectively circulate all of these plastic products and keep them in the economy and out of the environment. Obviously, as mentioned before, the reporting, the monitoring of progress is extremely important. And here we see some extracts from the 2019 and the 2020 annual reports. So in different types of action areas. So in this case here, we see that in 2019 report, we saw some new commitments from some of the signatories from the private sector. Actually, this is mainly for 3 of the signatories that were kind of the first movers into setting targets to reduce their use of virgin plastics. And with their commitments of virgin plastic reduction by 2025, these 3 global companies were going to be saving, or are going to be saving, 5 million tons of new plastic, or virgin plastic, which is equivalent to, well, here you see the numbers, which begin to seem quite impressive, considering that this is only for 3 big brands. The following year, we were also reporting, so that's for the 2020 report, but we were reporting on progress in 2019, and this refers to progress that has already happened. This is about in another target area, the amount of recycled plastic that was brought back into the economy by the brands and retail signatories. So all of those who are bringing plastic into the economy, their increased use of recycled content represented these CO2 savings, equivalent to taking over 250,000 cars off the road for the whole year. So again, important to report the progress and to keep everybody accountable. But as you know, the global commitment is not a standalone initiative. In fact, the vision shared in the global commitment is the same vision that unites the plastic pacts all over the world, and of this you know already a lot, but also the Global Tourism Plastics Initiative, which is the interface with with the tourism sector. The plastic pacts, as I see it, is like a local implementation operational mechanism to deliver the actions that all actors commit to in the global commitment. Whereas the Global Tourism Plastics Initiative, as mentioned, is the interface of the global commitment with the tourism sector. And here you see a bit more of the actors that are behind this, the Global Tourism Plastics Initiative. In case you're interested, you can find out more as well later in the website. But with this, I think I want to move to the second part of the presentation. And well, I guess if there are questions that I need to stop, I know that there's a time for questions and answers after this presentation. So if there's anything that we need to stop and discuss before, I hope that Kirsten, you will stop me and maybe address that question there and then, as I'm not seeing the Q&A section while I present. So in this second part, we're going a bit deeper into the latest studies that we've been pulling together from UNEP on single-use plastic products and their alternatives. So using life cycle assessment to learn, to see what do we learn about single-use plastic products and their alternatives. And again, on this, sorry, that was one click too much. The framing or the context where this comes from, again, I don't think I will have to explain a lot on the problems related to single-use plastic products pollution, single-use plastic products, and well, I will be using this acronym quite a bit, the SUPP. We hear a lot about single-use plastics, but I like to say, and I like to remind that there's no such thing as single-use plastic because the use is defined by the product, not the material. So that's why we use the two Ps, which might sound a bit strange for some of you. So of course, they are single-use plastic products. They are a big share of the plastic waste that is being generated. And the reason is obvious. I mean, these are products of high volume. Usually, I mean, packaging is a big part of them, but they are they are designed to be used only once, which means that we're continuously using them, and well, the volumes and the tonnage generated is massive. They certainly generate this big problem in terms of the volumes and the fact that they escape also the normal waste management streams many times because of their low value, and therefore they escape and present a big threat in the environment. The member states captured very well this context and the fact that we need to find alternatives to single-use plastic products, single-use plastic items. But also they identified that these alternatives may not always be better than the single-use plastic products. So we need to find the alternatives, but also we need to find that these alternatives actually reduce the impacts across the full life cycle and considering all the environmental impacts. And as mentioned, the member states captured this problematic in the context of the 4th United Nations Environment Assembly, that took place, as mentioned, in March, and they put it in this resolution 9, resolution 4/9, on addressing single-use plastic products pollution. This was a request, or this resolution included a request to UNEP, for UNEP to generate information about, or to put together the information about the impacts of single-use plastic products and their alternatives across their life cycle. And this is work that has kept us busy. Well, this specific stream of work started in 2019. And here you see some of the latest milestones in terms of there's been quite big stakeholder consultations, and we keep kind of an open channel of consultations with industry, with governments, on what they're doing about single-use plastic products and their alternatives, what life cycle assessment studies exist. We've been publishing some of these studies, and we'll see a few results now. So first, starting with shopping bags, but also beverage bottles, takeaway food packaging. There was also quite a lot of webinars to reach out to member states, to see presentation as well of what member states are doing to address single-use plastic products pollution with a life cycle approach. Further studies on tableware, beverage cups, nappies was the latest one incorporated, and we're very soon going to publish studies as well on menstrual products and face masks. And next year, we will see also further work on food packaging. In particular, there was also this integrative report publication that was published and launched in the UNEA event earlier this year in February 2021. And we will also see some extracts of the results of the conclusions from this report. So I mean, of course, we probably don't need to remind what life cycle assessment is, and LCA, not at this stage anyway. But the important thing is that the studies that I've been mentioning, I mean, most of them are already available online, including this integrative report that I mentioned here. And also, it's a good opportunity to remind or to acknowledge the great contribution that we've been having from the knowledge partners, IVL in Sweden, that collaborated with some of the first studies, and importantly as well, TGH ThinkSpace in South Africa. And I'm really glad that Pippa Notten will be also talking of other other elements today, but I mean, she's been the main author of many of these publications that are available online. So very nice acknowledgement here to TGH ThinkSpace. In the website as well, if you're interested, in this website that you see here, you will also find the recordings of webinars that disseminate more and specifically about all of these reports. So if you want to go even deeper, please visit the website. So this overall report, the report on addressing single-use plastic products pollution using a life cycle approach, and now we kind of start going specific into what life cycle assessment studies tell us about single-use plastic products and their alternatives. But if we had to sum it up in one conclusion, is that the most problematic element about single-use plastic products is the single-use part, the single-use nature. Because actually, when we see that we are shifting from single-use plastic products to single-use products of a different material, actually the impacts tend to change, but they are not really reduced. We're just shifting the area of impact, but we're not really solving the problems. So member states are then encouraged to promote the actions that lead to keeping the resources at the highest value by replacing single-use plastic products with reusable products. So this is kind of the other or the secondary conclusion, which is that reusable products tend to be better. They not always are better from an environmental point of view than single-use ones, but they can be better when the right conditions are met. And in the majority of cases, actually, these conditions are there. So reusable products, in the majority of cases, I mean, they are the safer bet that they will deliver less impacts on the environment. Of course, in all of this, taking the life cycle approach in helping to support the right decision adequate for the country at hand is extremely important. Again, these are some of the main conclusions of this report. In this slide, we see some of the policy recommendations as well, and how the life cycle assessment studies of all these products have or can be distilled into these main policy recommendations. I didn't describe it before, but in all of these studies, what we've done is not new studies, not new LCA studies on those products. They are actually meta studies. They are compilations of the available LCA literature on the different products. So we've actually been collecting a lot of the learnings and comparing them, and understanding what are the key drivers for conclusions, sometimes going one way and sometimes going another way. And in all of these analyses, in all of the meta-analysis, what we find is that, as mentioned, reusable products are environmentally preferable to single-use ones, and that doesn't depend on the material. So a reusable plastic product can also be better than single-use products that are not plastic. So the issue is not just about the plastic. And of course, this is very important. This is a very peculiar material. It can be very good, but at the same time, we can also make very wrong use of it. So the issue is not just plastic, it's how we use it. When we're doing policies that are based on life cycle assessments and policies to reduce this pollution, we need to consider the country where we're applying the policy very well. There are many conditions that can affect the results. What is the energy mix in the country? Is it mostly fossil-based? Is it nuclear-based? Is it based on renewable energy? That changes the results quite a bit. What is the waste management? Do we have a sophisticated waste management? Is always being collected, and we have modern technologies to treat waste, or is waste sometimes not fully collected, a part of it going directly into the environment, mostly going into dump sites or landfills? These also affects the results significantly. But importantly, and that's something that we tend to forget, consumer behavior is extremely important, and not just about what the consumer does with the waste. Do the consumer recycle? Do they segregate for recycling? Do they just litter? But it's not just that, it's also how they use the products. And particularly for reusable products, consumers can have a massive impact on the final impact, for good and for bad. Obviously, accessibility to alternatives is important. It's, we can ban certain products, but if there are no alternatives, what's going to happen in the market? And certainly considering the cultural aspects. This is particularly important when we are sending the message that reusable products are better, because of course, sometimes the reusable alternatives may not be so socially acceptable. So we need to work on that part as well. As mentioned, affecting the user behavior, for instance, in washing the reusable products, and we're going to see a bit more of that right now. And also issues like costs. And we often hear, oh, well, but single-use plastic products are cheaper. Well, they are not. And that's a very clear message that we need to send. Single-use plastic products are definitely not cheaper. It's just that they don't pay for the costs that they generate. So if we incorporate all the costs as well of not just the cost of production, but also considering the cost of littering, considering as well that some of these products, particularly plastic, are subsidized through indirectly through fossil fuel subsidies. When we take all of these things into consideration, the cost that is actually perceived is often very different from the cost that is the real cost. And that's, if we're going to base decisions on cost, we might as well look at the real one rather than what we perceive. So these are some of the conclusions or some of the recommendations for policymakers. The recommendations in this report as well deal with how policy can be using life cycle assessment studies when informing policies on single-use plastic products pollution. I'm not going to dwell into all of these key factors that need to be taken into account, but they essentially go through elements that I was just mentioning. So it's important, essentially to consider that reusable alternatives are better. So if we're going to compare alternatives, let's not stick to the direct single-use to single-use product. Consider as well the reusable alternatives. Consider that the sources of information, well, we need probably several sources of information. Peter was mentioning it in the beginning. Life cycle assessment do not generally consider the impacts of marine litter or litter in general in the environment, although we're advancing fast as well on getting methodology in this area, and there's also specific projects of the Life Cycle Initiative that I think will be mentioned later. The project Marilka on incorporating the marine impacts in LCA. This is work in progress. At the moment, you need to look at life cycle assessment results in the context as well of other type of studies. As mentioned, I will not go into all of these, but if you want these 10 factors, these are kind of the key learnings, the quick guide on how to address single-use plastic products pollution using a life cycle approach. In terms of the policies that we've seen across countries that already take life cycle approaches into consideration, The key message is that these policies tend to address the whole system, and that's what we need. We need the systems change. We need to shift from the perspective that we can use resources once and then throw them away to considering how can we use materials differently and more efficiently within the economy. Normally, we cannot address the pollution from plastics, and particularly single-use plastics, plastic products, with one single policy intervention. We usually need multiple actions that look at what happens in different stages of the life cycle. And it's extremely important all the time to get this communication and buy-in from the different actors, because this has been mentioned many times as well by the government. We need all stakeholders, and we need all of them to act, and to act in a concerted way, so we can shift the economy from a linear plastics economy to a circular plastics economy. And of course, this will require particular attention to those that most need to change their operations. The companies that are currently manufacturing single-use plastic products, they will need to change, because there's no way that we can continue with these types of products. So they will need the support to shift their operations to different business models, and that needs to be considered. Of course, there's also vulnerable consumers that might be dependent on specific types of products, and we need to look at what these consumers can do. Extremely important as well to continue with the monitoring and the assessment of not just the impacts of the policies, but also their effectiveness, and then coordinate and integrate across different levels, so from local to national, regional, and importantly as well, the international approaches, where a lot of discussions are being held as we speak, and as probably you know. So two key messages from these policies before we move into the specific product studies is that it's, I insist, and sorry that I kind of make myself a bit repetitive, but it's important to insist on this element, that it's the single use of any product, regardless of its material, that is a problem, that tends to be problematic. So we need to revise the single use, the disposability of what we're doing. We need to move beyond the disposable economy. And also that there is already a wealth of information and resources available that can support these policies. We can always learn more, and we continue to learn more, but this is not an excuse for not taking action. We already know enough to actually start acting now. And well, again, I don't think I need to convince anybody here, because South Africa is already acting significantly, and this webinar is also a proof of it. So if we move now to some sample infographics of the studies that I've been mentioning. This is one of the latest reports published this year on beverage caps. And here we want to show a bit more graphically the conclusions that I've been already mentioning, and a bit more detail, of course, going into a bit more granularity. I hope you will be able to see in the slides properly. Otherwise, I mean, of course, the study is online, and you can also download the slides later on, so you will be able to read better. But essentially, what we see here, this graph is extracting some of the key parameters that influence the results of the LCA studies. When we compare single-use beverage cups, single-use plastic beverage cups, and their alternatives. In the columns, we're differentiating some of the key behaviors from consumers, whether consumers are rather eco-conscious or cost-conscious, so consumers that tend to save, thrifty if you want, versus consumers that are perhaps a bit more indifferent. And then three key areas of these behaviors related, for instance, on how, of course, in the context of if they have reusable cups, how they wash them. This is extremely important. Whether the cups are actually reused. So, of course, an eco-conscious consumer will reuse the reusable cup many times, whereas perhaps the indifferent consumer, even if it's a reusable cup, might not ensure that it's reused. And then what happens with the cup at the end of life, if this is separated and treated and recycled adequately, or just littered or thrown with the general waste. And here we also see a few factors in terms of the characteristics in the economy, in terms of whether the electricity grid is more or less based on renewables, what the waste management looks like, what type of technologies are there for the waste. So, and then what we see in terms of the preference is in the blue, with this diagram here, with this icon, we see that the reusable cap would be preferable in all of these cells, whereas in this kind of pink, orange, we see that single use become preferable. And as you can see, the results are usually favorable to reusable caps, but in certain circumstances, this is not the case, especially if the reusable caps are not reused enough, because this is an obvious one. If you design a more sturdy cap that can be reused, that is made for lasting, but we only use it once or twice, then of course this has higher impacts than a single-use one. But if you're using it and reusing it adequately, in the majority of circumstances, the reusable cap can be better. Then again, if the reusable cap is always washed in an efficient way as well, and the waste management is, in this case, for instance, if the waste management is poor, reusable caps will be better because the single-use ones will tend to be litter more easily. Depending on the electricity mix, depending on the waste management, it can be that single-use caps can actually be better. For instance, if the electricity grid is super based on fuel, on fossil fuels, then the washing stage might actually make the reusable caps less preferable than the single-use ones. But again, this depends very much, as mentioned, on the country. Although the general recommendation is that reusable caps tend to be, or can be better environmentally in the majority of cases. So I think this gives already quite a good overview of where the results are going in the case of this specific product. And this is what we learned from the LCAs. When we move to this other type of product, this is tableware, so kind of the plates, the cutlery used in the context of whatever events or hospitality. Here it was, it took the team quite a struggle to get to this infographic. And in the end, the key recommendation was on whether reusable is a practicable option or if reusable is impractical. And then, of course, this comes with a big caveat, because when reusable is a practicable option, and there can be, the facilities to wash and store the tableware, reusable is always better. And there's no, it's very, very difficult that single use will actually be more efficient, more preferable than reusable. Except, of course, if we see that the reusable is not going to be reused, just like we saw before. If reusable tableware is going to be used only once or twice, then single use is preferable because, of course, it's made with much less material. But the big caveat, as I was mentioning here, the big important notice is that in general, if the reusable option is made practical, if we can ensure that it will actually be reused, even in situations where we can think this is impractical, like large events outdoors, imagine a music festival in the times of pre-COVID, but hopefully one day we'll get back to those festivals, to the sports events. We can think that reusable options are impractical there, but we just need to make them practical, and then they are also likely to be much better. And how to make them practical? Well, if you put a return fee, so when you're buying your drink in the stadium, you're putting a deposit for the cup. When you return the cup, you get the deposit back. You just need to make the deposit big enough, and actually, even if it's small, it might not make some consumers return their cup, but somebody else will pick the cup that they left behind and will bring it back to get the deposit. So if you make this to be practical, in that case, again, the reusable option can be better. What this graph shows is that essentially we didn't find LCA results that already prove that, because these systems many times are not yet in place. I hope that that nuance was clear. But again, the conclusions are not really that much different when we move from one type of product to the other. But of course, there are always considerations. And certainly when we shift to a product which is already much more complex, like nappies, this is the latest product that was published just a couple of months ago, I think. And again, we see a very similar structure to what we saw with the caps. So again, looking at the consumer behavior and how it is extremely important, the consumer behavior can play such a big role. So as you can see, with an eco or cost-conscious consumer, reusable nappies are clearly preferable most of the times. Whereas if the same nappies are not used properly, if we have an indifferent consumer that doesn't behave the way that they could behave, the single-use nappies can actually be preferable from an overall environmental point of view. And a key element here is whether the nappies are reused often enough. So certainly if we make nappies which are durable, that can last even for generations, and they can be passed from sibling to sibling, and we use them only a few times and then throw them away, then of course in this case, well, it's better if you already buy the single-use nappies straight away. But then of course as well, depending on how the waste management is treated, and this is one clear preference where, regardless of what happens, most of the times the reusable nappies tend to be better, simply because they are made with less materials and also have an easier way of being managed. The washing stage, and that's an extremely important consideration, how the consumer washes the nappies. This has a great impact on the nappies, and certainly using them and washing them in an efficient way makes the reusable nappies better. If we, are washing in an efficient way, using too much water, too high temperature, drying them in a tumble dryer rather than in the line, then the reusable nappies can actually be worse, and you might be better off with single-use ones. But again, this is an important product, a very specific one, and also quite interesting findings that were published recently. I'll quickly go because so we want to leave more time for questions, but I'll quickly go through some of the other studies that we thought might be of interest. In the case of single-use plastic shopping bags and their alternatives, again, the results are not too different. So reusable bags, they tend to have less environmental impacts than single-use bags if used enough times. Here we say many times. How many is many? Well, that depends a little bit on the material. But the key thing with bags, but with all the other products, is that the point at which, or the number of uses that reusable products need to be used in order to be better, is usually a number that is not just feasible, it's normal, it's natural. In the case of shopping bags, depending on the types, I mean, if we're comparing single-use plastic bags with reusable plastic bags, so also bags made out of very little amount of plastic, but that are sturdy enough to last. Usually they can last for tens or hundreds of times. Usually at 4 or between 4-10 reuses, the reusable option is already better. So that's kind of a number that is pretty low. With some other materials, and we found that particularly with cotton, perhaps you need to be reusing the cotton bag as much as 100 times, sometimes less, depends on the design. But the thing again is that this number of times is not ludicrous. It's a number of times that is perfectly achievable. So with the right products, with the right incentives for them to be reused adequately, the reusable products are better. But a key conclusion as well, and particularly because plastic bags are one of the key targets for bans and for policies in many governments, we wanted to make the point that reducing the impact of bags is not just about banning a specific type of bags or recommending specific materials, or saying, well, you know, you cannot use single-use plastic bags, but it's fine to use single-use paper bags, for instance. It's really about changing the consumer behavior. And the key point is really shifting from single-use bags to reusable bags. And well, we like this conclusion, which sounds very kind of down to earth and commonsensical, but of course, it's important to remind that, you know, the shopping bag that has the least environmental impact is the bag that the consumer already has at home. So if you don't need to produce an extra bag, then don't produce it, because that always generates an impact regardless of what material. So if you have a bag and you can reuse it many times, that's the best option. Common sense, but important to say. So moving now to the final set of products, and here we put together both beverage bottles and takeaway food containers, simply because, again, the conclusions are quite similar and quite repetitive. And the key one is that the reusable bottles and reusable takeaway food containers are preferable most of the times. There are, of course, important characteristics that determine the environmental impacts, and particularly when we're looking into different single-use versions, the type of material, the weight. When we compare with reusable options, the number of users always makes the key difference. I mean, if you reuse them enough, then the reusable are better. If not, then single-use will be better. But this is, again, just repeating quite a bit what has already come across in all the other studies. Again, with bottles and with takeaway food containers, the key point is how do we achieve and how do we make this practical so the necessary number of uses is achieved? We can make that happen. That's not about the LCA. That's about the system, the management system, the business model that we put behind these products. So now this is yes, finally the final slide, and just kind of some concluding remarks for this first part of the workshop today, and I hope that was clear enough. But the key message here is that we're talking about a system change that we really need to affect and to change the whole economy. It's not just about waste management. It's not just about the specific material, one specific type of product, but the fact that the products are being designed currently to be used only once, and that is the key problem. Designing products to make them disposable is the thing that we really need to change. So we need to shift to a reusable economy, or a circular economy, if you want, more globally. And for this, we have instruments like the extended producer responsibility, which play a key part. It's not the only solution, but certainly a well-designed EPR scheme will not only help in managing the waste at the end of life, but also in sending the right incentives to design the better products to begin with. Importantly as well, we need to quantify the flows of plastic products, and monitoring and reporting the products in reducing the plastic pollution. It's absolutely key. So we said we need to move into these reusable options to reduce the amount of plastic that is going through the economy, and then monitoring and reporting, as mentioned. We need to identify that, we need to see that we're actually shifting the needle, that we're if we had a dashboard of plastic pollution, we really need to see that the actions that we're putting in place are bringing that needle down, that we really are affecting plastic pollution. And of course, the report that we've seen, for which we've seen the results, the report that IUCN delivered, provides already a baseline that is very useful for South Africa. I know that there are other studies that we're working with different numbers here. Well, we need to look at all of those studies and then identify what are the numbers that we use, but then having that baseline is extremely important. And then, of course, move in the right direction from the baseline. Importantly as well, we have enough information to act, so we must act now. The action is required now. And of course, for that, ensuring that the action is concerted and that we are working together with international collaboration as well. The plastics value chain is not national. It moves across countries, moves across borders. we need to work together in order to deliver impact. And maybe as a final message and a plea from UNEP would be that certainly it would be good to commit to the actions of the global commitment as part of the work that you're already doing greatly in the context of the South African Plastics Pact. So maybe it's putting this international dimension as well into ensuring that you're counting all of these actions towards international targets. And with that, I'll close it here, and I hope I didn't use too much time so that we still have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Llorenç. You're actually 3 minutes ahead of time, so thank you so much. And I'd like to thank you for highlighting the urgency of the action that is required. And I think another thing to consider is that we do need to, in driving a circular economy for plastics, we're considering system change. And within this webinar, we're particularly focusing on the use of LCA to drive performance in our mandatory extended producer responsibility system that is very new in this country. So thank you for just highlighting also the depth of information. And I think, as you mentioned, these documents collating the information out there and the specific points of consideration under each product are very useful on which to base the further development of our policy, as well as the specific guidelines for our LCAs. So thank you very much for highlighting that. And I think also what we've heard repeatedly through Llorenç's presentation is the need to focus on local systems and local data. And that is something that will be highlighted throughout this presentation or towards the end of this webinar by the CSIR, Valentina and William, and then Pippa from the Greenhouse and UCT. We're going to look at what we specifically need in place in order to have the wise use of LCAs in our developing EPR system. So thank you very much for your comments there. So I'd like to go to a couple of questions. We have a very busy expert panel in the background, so there's been a lot of answering and the sharing of the questions. I'd just like to highlight something and responded to by Dumisani. Nick asked around the LCA start date being extended by a year. So Dumisani has clarified that within 2 years, they'd ask producers to indicate their readiness to conduct LCAs, and then within the regulations, it's within 5 years of the EPR plans coming into place that we need to see LCAs in place. We also had Georgina highlighting the ecosystem conditions that we need to enable LCA. And Llorenç, you did speak about the policy, that the 10 factors need to be considered by policymakers. So that was very helpful. And you'll see that in the Q&A if you're able to access it now. But I think please feel free to add your wisdom there. But I think a lot of that does speak to our South African situation. So we'll get our South African contingent to answer later. I'd like to take you to one of the questions from Michelle, one of our converters. You highlight recycled content as a way of helping to close the loop. What do you see within your extensive experience? What is the role and potential of bioplastics, plastics derived from plants, rather than oil, gas, or coal in driving circularity?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I see also that Haro would like to chip in here, so please also do. Yes, I mean, in terms of the bioplastics, the questions there are also quite different. What we've seen particularly when we're making identical bioplastics, so plastics which, as you well say, are derived from bio-based material, but that are actually mimicking the exact molecule. So we can have bio-based PET or bio-based polyethylene. When we have this plastic, it does not behave, and the environmental impacts are not necessarily much different to the fossil-based plastic. Of course, the potential that this has is that we are then decoupling ourselves, or if you want, we're not depending or not making ourselves dependable of the fossil fuel economy, which has many related as well environmental impacts. But then, of course, once you put that molecule into the economy, the considerations are the same. We still want to keep it in the economy for it to make part of reusable products that are designed in a way that they keep the value of this material. one of the key considerations, of course, with bio-based products is that they are not, well, that their competition for land and for resources that we also need for food production is not driving too much of that use. So using particularly waste materials to generate this bioplastic seems to be one of the key kind of the best avenues for development, rather than using sugar directly or you know, maize or other types of products that we could use directly for food or for feed. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you, Llorenç. Hera, would you like to add something here?
I think Llorenç has answered that question very well. Yeah, not a lot to add. You know, one really does need to look at both the front end and the back end of the life cycle when one talks bio-based materials. And at the front end, unfortunately, often they come with higher impacts in a number of categories, just because the way industrial agriculture is done. So one needs to be careful there. At the back end of the life cycle, I think Llorenç correctly indicates, once we put valuable stuff into the economy, we should try and keep it there. The one that, and I'd appreciate Llorenç's view on that as well, is when we send packaged goods into the deep rural areas for consumption, then it becomes really difficult to return things back into technical systems. And I'm sort of wondering whether there's a unique place there for packaging that is indeed biodegradable, so that can stay on one of those 17,000 inhabited islands of Indonesia or in the deep rural areas in South Africa. So whether that is just the bagasse fiber, which we are starting to see now as a clamshell, and that of course is used more urban and rural, but you know, whether we're using that kind of fiber byproduct directly, or whether we're turning it into one of the biopolymers that ultimately should degrade if it's left on the farmyard. I'd appreciate your view there.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and yeah, certainly I think we need to consider the end use and what's happening and what are the possibilities for reverse logistics and things like that. I think the key point as well. So certainly on the biodegradable side of things, and that's also an important distinction. It's, you know, what we're doing in terms of the feedstock, or whether the material has been designed to be biodegraded. The key point there as well is whether it actually biodegrades. And yes, I think the example that you were mentioning with kind of bagasse, not always, but you know, we can have these types of packaging that do degrade even in a home compost setting, because many times what we know as biodegradable plastic will only biodegrade in large-scale industrial facilities, which are also not available in rural areas normally. So even if that is put with the home compost, it will take too long usually to degrade. But certainly for some of these uses, yes, biodegradable plastic products may be part of the solution. And I mean, it's really not saying anything against this as a solution, but I think for the bulk of the problematic that we're seeing today, they will not be the one solution that will solve it. I think we need to consider, particularly also because if we start adding biodegradable properties, and then this is mixed with the other types of recyclable plastic, then that can actually complicate the recycling process and maybe actually a worse solution overall. But yes, indeed, when we're talking of, you know, situations with lower volume, remote areas where the collection cannot arrive, or the reverse logistic doesn't work, well, that can be a solution. I am a strong advocate, though, that, well, if we think that the reverse logistic doesn't work, well, how is it that the logistics to get the product there worked? How is it that they cannot be taking the used products back? I think there is a way in which we can make things work if we really try. So that's my general message. But of course, it's not easy. It just needs us to think differently.
Thank you so much, Hera and Llorenç, for that interesting discussion there. And I think we have further challenges put out to our brand owners and those who place products in the market in South Africa. So challenges in terms of what does extended producer responsibility look like in the deep rural areas versus the metros, and also challenges in terms of logistics models. And, you know, the handling of the wastes does bring a complexity in terms of the contamination of that material. But we do see some innovative solutions globally. So I think we've also addressed in that discussion Aidan's comment, partly at least. So I think, Aidan, you were referring to here completely biodegradable and bioplastic. So organic source for the plastic material, as well as biodegradable to natural compounds. We are going to be commenting further in terms of evaluating the options due to LCA. So there are developments in LCA that look at both factoring in littering as well as persistence in the environment. So we're going to be commenting on that just now. So please do stay tuned. Also an interesting comment from Avodia, that if we had a stronger reuse market, we could then impact behavior change and decrease the single-use disposal practices. So Avodia there, highlighting often the chicken and egg situations that we have within system change. So we need the solution to be presented to consumers, but we also do need sufficient uptake to justify those solutions. So there's work on both sides there. So thank you so much, Avodia.
And if I can just add one point there, because this is an extremely relevant point. And I want to remind everybody, in the 50s and the 60s, I'm talking last century here, our parents, our grandparents, I mean, depending on the age around here, but they actually had to be educated to throw things away. I mean, they were not used to throw things away. And this new wave of disposable products, there had to be a strong communication to let them know that, no, actually, you know, once you've used this bottle, just throw it away. Don't keep it at home. We had to change that behavior. It took time, because it's not natural, or it's not what we would naturally do, particularly if we come from a more thrifty economy. So this can be done, but certainly we need to pay attention there. And once we get back into these behaviors, which are a bit more kind of conservative in terms of conserving the resources in the economy, yes, then I think things will certainly work more easily. So I think that was a very good comment.
Thanks, Llorenç, and thank you for highlighting that, and the education needs to do that reversal. And interesting that it wouldn't have been, as you mentioned, it wouldn't have been natural just to throw something away. And sadly, we can see the very effective education awareness campaigns that have us where we are today, with a huge number of huge amounts of our resources simply being disposed after very short timescales into holes in the ground. Great. Thank you so much for that comment. I think I'd just like to highlight one other comment. There was a comment on potential outright bans on plastic production. And when we speak about elimination, what does that mean? And it's generated a bit of discussion in that Q&A function. I'd like to highlight Harrow's comments. So Prof. van Blottens from UCT, outright bans are simplistic cop-outs of regulators who cannot engage with complexity. A very interesting, very strong point of view. This is an industry with millions of jobs globally, reaching into every corner of modern living. And I think that's a very useful and interesting point. I saw a comparison on the use of stone aggregate in our society, and there have been calls to stop quarrying and accessing of that raw material. I saw a very interesting sort of promotional video on what it would mean if we completely removed extractive industries right now. And it would be really interesting to run a short clip on the complete removal of plastics from our society. So definitely, Aisha, we are aiming for a circular economy for plastics here. And there has been some comments, so please do feel free to engage with that. Oh, we have quite a number of questions, I think. Just a last one from Philippa before we move on to the next question, or the next section of our webinar. Philippa says she's referring to the recycling of reusable items, but the ones which may be less obvious to consumers, such as metal water bottles. which are often promoted as the preferred option to the reusable and then recyclable. Llorenç, I don't know if you want to answer that. I'm not particularly familiar with the design of metal water bottles. My assumption is that they could, the bottle itself can simply go into the metal recycling stream. But Llorenç, you want to comment?
This is a super important consideration because indeed, I mean, reusable products get also to their end of life. So sometimes, I mean, maybe less obvious for a metal bottle, which seems like indestructible, and of course you can use it for many years. But even when we're talking of the commercial reusable plastic bottles, glass bottles that we see, for instance, in hospitality, they also have a set number of uses, and beyond that, they need to be recycled. So indeed, this recyclability needs to be taken into consideration. It is not technologically problematic on the majority of cases because we're talking of monomaterial products. The problem is that indeed, and that's something that we found, for instance, with reusable beverage cups, even if they are made of the same material that can be currently recycled, because they are thicker, the recycling machines are often not thought to take these products in, because simply they are more sturdy, they are more resistant, and chopping them down takes a different type of machine. So this is certainly something that needs to be considered. Again, it's not something that can stop or that will make it less preferable. It's something that needs to be considered, because otherwise, yes, the recyclability, which is important because those products will also reach an end of use, might actually be might be stopped. So I hope that was clear and didn't create confusion. But yeah, in general, they must be recyclable at their end of use, in addition to being reusable. Technologically, this is not a problem, but it needs to be considered because there might be implications for the machines, the recycling machines.
Okay, thanks very much, Llorenç. And I think that highlights, as you've just been saying, design with the system in mind. And any new material or product put on the market needs to engage with the value chain throughout the end of life and the new life of that same material. So thank you so much. So thank you, Llorenç. We highly appreciate your time and expertise. And Llorenç will be, as part of our panel, actively engaging in the chat as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, thank you. So now we're going to move to the next section of our webinar. And Aidan, we did predict your question there, because now we're moving on to integrating litter into LCAs, the need and approach, by Dr. Takunda Chitaka, University of the Western Cape. So Dr. Chitaka is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of the Western Cape, investigating opportunities for growth along e-waste and organic waste value chains in South Africa. In 2019-2020, Takunda was a visiting research fellow at Massey University in New Zealand, and she developed a research project investigating plastic waste flows in New Zealand, which included coordinating fieldwork and negotiating access to stakeholders. Takunda's PhD research was conducted at UCT under Prof. Harro van Blotnitz, and this was on the inclusion of leakage into life cycle management of products involving plastic as a material choice, in which she investigated the life cycle management of plastic products identified as prone to leakage into the marine environment in South Africa, including sustainability impacts of potential interventions. Takunda specializes in material flow analysis, multi-criteria decision analysis, life cycle assessment and management, sustainability assessment, and waste management. So once again, we have an expert to address us. Takunda, we are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for the introduction. So as Kirsten mentioned, I will be talking about integrating leakage into LCA. So this covers your littering and your dumping and your mismanaged waste. So the need has been spoken about by Llorenç and Peter Manyara as a weakness within LCA. So just to start off with a quick reminder, I'm sure we're all very aware of the impact associated with plastic pollution. But just to get us back in that frame of mind, in the marine environment, the types of impacts include entanglement, smothering, and ingestion, and they've been very well documented. A review conducted in 2016 found that documented deaths associated with plastic were 63 due to ingestion, 29% due to entanglement, and 8% due to smothering. Cases of entanglement and ingestion of plastic by wildlife has also been documented. Another area of concern is the toxicity associated with chemicals added to plastic due to the potential for them leaching hazardous chemicals from the plastic material, making it bioavailable for marine life. In addition, plastics have the potential to attract hydrophobic contaminants, such as persistent organic pollutants and metals, transferring them to an organism system upon ingestion. So this gets us in the frame of mind for this discussion. So when we look at mismanaged plastic, researchers have seen more concerted efforts to quantify it. I'm sure you're all familiar with the work conducted by Jambek in 2015, where they estimated flows of waste into the ocean, including estimating the fraction of mismanaged waste. A quick glance indicates that the state of solid waste management in developing countries with significantly larger fractions of mismanaged waste in comparison to our more developed counterparts. In that, Jambek et al. Estimate that South Africa has 56% mismanaged plastic waste. Taking a closer look at the situation in South Africa, according to the General Household Survey conducted by Stats SA in 2019, just shy of 59% of people had access to weekly refuse removal. Access to weekly refuse removal has been decreasing since 2016, when it reached a high of 65.4%. So what do people without access to weekly refuse removal do? Well, as you can see, 30% have just had to develop their own refuse dump, which they use, whilst 3% just dump or leave their rubbish anyway. That being said, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with estimating mismanaged plastic waste. Using the example of plastic flows into the environment, in 2015, Jambek estimated 90,000 to 250,000 tons flowing into the marine environment in 2010 from South Africa. A more recent estimate by Verster and Bowman estimated 15,000 to 40,000 tons. This is not to mean that, hey, we got a lower estimate than Jambek, so we should relax. Whatever the numbers are, there's clearly a problem that needs to be addressed. Looking at more granular data, one can see that items associated with food consumed on the go are more likely to end up in the environment. Using the example of a bead survey conducted in Cape Town in 2017, 9 of the 10 most prevalent items were all associated with food consumed on the go. In addition, these 10 items alone, out of about 370 identified items during the surveys, accounted for 40 to 57% of collected debris. So we can already see what are problematic items. And even without going into the LCA, this should spur us into action, say, you know what, our biscuit wrappers are a problem, so let's start looking for a way to address them, for example. So how does this look with LCA? Well, as both Peter and Llorenç mentioned, there's currently no ISO certified life cycle impact assessment method for including leakage into life cycle assessment. However, it is currently a priority area for researchers in this space. So just to go through the different approaches that have been proposed by researchers when it comes to incorporating leakage into life cycle assessment. In 2005, James and Grant proposed two rudimentary indicators using the example of shopping bags. So for them, they proposed an indicator that looks at the aesthetic. So when you're looking at littering, the aesthetic value of the area decreases. And they based this on the degradation rate, so how long it would remain visible for people to see. They also proposed litter marine biodiversity, an indicator for that. And this was simply based on how long the bag would sink or float as an indication for potential for entanglement or ingestion. So you can see these were very rudimentary indicators, but they represented a start in the thinking about how to integrate leakage into LCA. In 2019, a littering potential indicator was proposed once again using the case of bags. The indicator was a bit more complex than James and Grant's one and was based on 4 factors. Firstly, the number of bags. This was put over the probability of the bag being abandoned in the environment. So they linked this to the bag price. So they say that if a bag is more expensive, people are more likely to take care of it and not discard it willy-nilly. They also looked at the environmental dispersion, so the bag weight, as an indicator of how likely it was to be blown away. And then the last factor they looked at was its environmental persistence. So how long it would stay within the environment using the degradability of the bag as the indicator. Another, also in 2019, a preliminary effect and factor for working towards including the impacts of entanglement in plastic waste on marine biodiversity in LCA was proposed. So an effect factor helps to characterize the impacts of something for the development of a life cycle impact assessment methodology. So this is where this work was situated. They were now working towards developing an LCIA methodology. So what they did is they coupled estimates of species affected by entanglement with microplastic density estimates. However, the authors made sure to highlight that the lack of information surrounding the relationship between litter density and the extent to which a species population may be affected is a constraint to the robustness of the model. So what they're saying is there was a lack of information regarding the differences in litter density and how these would affect a species population. Coming closer to home, the CSIR is currently developing a persistence indicator whereby they use persistence in the environment as a proxy indicator for potential marine impacts. You'll hear more about this in the next presentation from William and Valentina. Also close to home is the development of leakage rate as a proxy indicator for potential marine impacts in the environment. So a leakage rate, we defined it with myself and Prof. Harrow as a fraction of air waste entering the environment. It's a very simple equation whereby you take the total accumulation rate based on your beach surveys, so the number of items per year, and you put it over waste generated. And for us, we use the sales figures for waste generators because with single-use products which are linked to high consumption volumes, you can assume that it would be directly linked between the sales and the waste generated. And in this, I'd just like to emphasize the role of industry, brand owners, retailers in providing this information, because having to find waste generated, we used SKU data from a market research report, but we need willingness from brand owners to actually state, you know, of my ketchup bottles, we produced 500,000 bottles in whatever year. So using an example of this, we looked at the leakage rates from Cape Town using the previous results I showed you from the beach surveys. And for the high prevalence items, you could see the leakage rates went all the way up to 83%. The reason we include the standard error is to emphasize how uncertain these results are. But what we want you to focus on is the relative difference in the leakage rate. So if you look at beverage bottle lids, they have a leakage rate of 83, but when you look at the beverage bottle itself, it's only a leakage rate of 5%, which is a very interesting example considering that beverage bottle lids and beverage bottles form one product. And we put this down to the characteristics of the product. So we know Pitco does a lot of great work and there's a very high, relatively high recycling rate of PET bottles. However, with the beverage bottle lids, after speaking with different recyclers, there's no consistency associated with the materials that are used. So they are now prone to leakage, which is one of the examples. Another one was cigarette butts, which is, we found a lot of cigarette butts, but the leakage rate was only 1%, which could be associated with the high density of cigarette butts. So maybe they sink and we couldn't find them. Or the fact that there's just so many cigarette butts that are generated, you know, over 4,000 million tons were generated in 2017. So with leakage rates, the value is looking at the relative leakage rate between different products. The leakage rates were also used in a life cycle assessment on different straws in South Africa. So we looked at polyprop, polylactide, paper, glass, and stainless steel. And in this case, I just want to focus on the end of life flows of these different straws. So for polyprop, polylactide, and paper, it was figured that they're disposable, so they're more likely to be littered than glass or stainless steel. I mean, when you take the case of a reusable cup, once you get your coffee and finish it, you're not likely to throw it out the window. You're likely to keep it with you and take it home to wash. So we estimated 38% of these straws entering the marine environment. There's also an estimate of open burning, which is a practice that happens in South Africa, the dumping of the different straws, as well as the potential recycling, which only was relevant for stainless steel, since the type of glass that's used for the straws is not currently recyclable. So that's another thing to keep in mind. This was mentioned by Philippa. What about the recycling of reusable steel bottles? Just because something's made out of steel or glass, the actual type of the glass, for example, might not necessarily be recyclable in the country. And then you also need to link this to degradability. So for polyprop, it's not compostable, it's not landfill degradable, it's not marine degradable, it's recyclable. It's a very persistent material. However, for paper, we found that you could compost it, it would degrade in the landfill and in the marine environment. None of them are recyclable except for stainless steel, as I mentioned. And then for polylactide, which I think we've all come across since it really just burst onto the market a few years ago, and it's become quite a popular alternative for plastic. There's a lot of questions surrounding its landfill degradability, and the marine degradability so far, researchers have found that it's not according to ASTM guidelines for marine degradability. Just to close, plastic pollution is a major problem in South Africa, as with the entire world. We can't continue to ignore it in LCAs just because there's no ISO certified impact assessment method. As I've shown, there's different types of ways to address it. Yes, the indicators may be somewhat rudimentary and we don't have the LCIA to support us. That doesn't mean that we can sit on our laurels and say, well, there's no impact assessment method, so I'm just going to ignore it and do the traditional LCA, which assumes an ideal waste management scenario. So these proxy indicators can play a very vital role in integrating leakage into LCA, and I just want to implore you to start making use of these indicators so you can have a more realistic perspective of the environmental impacts associated with products from cradle to grave. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Takunda. Very useful and helpful presentation. And I'd just like to highlight what you said, just because we don't have the appropriate or the ISO standard relating to littering persistence in terms of being able to understand the impact of the littered and the leaked plastics. Because I think what has created the focus on plastics and what has us reevaluating our plastic production and usage is the presence of plastics in the environment, is the growing global challenge that we have in terms of the visual impacts, as well as many other social, environmental impacts that are very evident in our world. So thank you so much. We really do appreciate your presentation. And then to kick us off, we have Michelle. Hi, Takunda. A while back, we calculated that a waste reclaimer would have to bend down to pick up in excess of 2,400 individual plastic closures. So talking about the bottle caps to earn a mere 10 Rand. So maybe that's also why there are far more caps than PET bottles on the beach. So we know the PET price is relatively high amongst the plastics, and even higher currently because of the increased demand for PET recycled. So just a comment there.
I absolutely agree. The factor of the price, when you have to figure out how many closures you have to pick up to actually make enough money, is a big factor. Which is why we're also seeing now some beverage manufacturers have actually put a little, they've printed on the lids, "Keep me with the bottle."
Yes.
So they're encouraging the closure to go with the bottle to recycling, so that it can at least be removed from the environment. But the question becomes, once it gets to recycling, what do they do with it? And when I last checked 2019, it was going to landfill. So the circularity there is still a big question.
Yes, but we do have an indication from some of our PT recyclers in the country that both the label material and the caps, that there are efforts to recycle. I think it's also market dependent. And I think it, once again, what we're highlighting here in this conversation. So we've also seen some best practice globally where we have tethering of closures to the base format. So closures, the caps, etc., are often very small format. So they're very likely to leak from formal waste management systems. And even in sorting plants, recycling plants, they can, you know, they can be lost from the system because of their size. So I think that's another interesting development. And I think just this once again highlights our need for extended producer responsibility, where our focus has been on the base format, the PET beverage bottle, yet we have disproportionate impacts from the smaller aspects from the caps and the EPR system. And we see from Petco now looking to handle the labels and closures on their PET beverage bottle stream within the same EPR scheme. Likely to then have more efficient capturing and more focus than there has already been on those caps and the labels. And we need to create that demand. We see the demand for PET beverage bottles, as Michelle has also highlighted, because of the higher price. So we need to work on those end markets, which is, of course, part of our EPR commitments. And then from Rob, is there clarity in the Section 18 legislation regarding what an identified product represents with respect to the requirement for an LCA? Would a PET bottle be an identified product? There's a vast number of packaging SKUs on the market. Will this be clarified by DFFE? Rob, that's something we're working on, and the experts on the line later in terms of their presentations will be presenting something of their recommendation for a way forward. So there's still much discussion to happen, but we do agree with you that to identify a single point at which LCAs are conducted is needed for clarity and to achieve the aims that we have in our EPR. So from Rob, regarding caps, I've heard that some PET recyclers set limits on non-PET materials. So collectors get less if the amount of PP exceeds a threshold. They are penalized, hence they remove the caps. Also, if the caps are left on the bottles, it's more difficult to compress. Thank you, Rob. Very interesting comment. And I think something that will be engaged with more fully within the developing EPR system. But Takunda, would you have any comments on that?
No comments on my end, no. Okay.
We note that you are here, the LCA expert, but if we do have recyclers, please put a response and maybe what the current practices and what the plans are going forward in terms of the caps. I do also note that the different recyclers for the different plastic types have differing approaches to the caps and closures depending on the polymer, depending on the plastic type of the caps and closures in relation to the base format. Please do put your comments, and this just highlights to our brand owners and retailers on the line where you are designing your own packaging to understand the complexity of the combination of the different packaging components and what that means during end of life. And then from Sinatemba, thanks Takunda, is it possible to group the items found on the beaches by brand or retailer, not just by type or format, just to bring the impact home? Takunda, would you like to comment there?
Thanks, Sinatemba. It's absolutely possible because you can actually read the brand owner or the retailer on the packaging in a lot of instances. And I'd just like to bring the example of, you saw biscuits were the #1 most prevalent item on Cape Town beaches. And it was a very specific biscuit brand that was found along all 5 of the beaches. So it's definitely possible to say, look, hey, X brand owner, this is your product. And I'm very aware of the fact that, you know, there is some cases, I'm not calling out any brand owner, but, you know, there is the fear that a brand owner will say, well, so what if there's snack packets? You can't prove that they're mine, you know, which I think is quite a not the right way to go about it. So yes, it is possible to go all the way down to the brand and the retailer. But my question back to you, Sinetembe, is why must we then publicly shame people for their products? If you know you make biscuits, why can't that just spur you to action to say, look, I don't want to be part of the problem?
Thank you very much, Takunda. And again, another challenge to the products that we place on the market in South Africa and our action related to them. So thanks very much. We do note that there are brand audits. There are some studies available globally looking at specific brand audits. We do have those available if you would like to consider those. And we know that some of our local South African NGOs are also moving towards brand audits in their litter and beach, etc. cleanups. And I think that there has been some data already generated. So thanks so much for that. Now if there are no further questions, I'm not seeing anything further in the Q&A. Please highlight if we have missed something. But we now come to the end of that section, of this section of our webinar. And we will then go, I think we should have a 5-minute break now. So by my watch, or let's make that 8-minute break. So by my timer, it's now 10:57. So if we're back at 11:05, and then we're going to deep dive into the more practicalities of a recommended South African response from our experts regarding LCA and considering the obligations in terms of our EPR regulations. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you back at 11:05. Thank you so much all. We pushed the break to as short as possible because now we're getting into South African specific discussion, and we look forward to active engagement. So thank you so much. We welcome you back to the session. And next up, we welcome LCA experts at the CSIR, William Stafford and Valentina Russo. William will be presenting on behalf of this brainy team. I'll just briefly introduce Valentina. Dr. Russo is a system engineer by education, specialized in life cycle assessment and systems thinking, and is currently a researcher in the Sustainable Economics and Waste Research Group at the CSIR. Dr. William Stafford is a principal researcher in the Sustainability Economics and Waste Research Group at the CSIR, and is also appointed as an extraordinary associate professor in the Department of Industrial Engineering at Stellenbosch University. So Prof is an experienced multidisciplinary researcher and leader with a balance of technical, financial, and management and leadership skills. He is a life scientist with R&D experience spanning 20 years. William's R&D interests include bioproducts, bioenergy, bioremediation, natural resources management, industrial ecology, and decision support for sustainable development. So thank you so much, William and Valentina. We invite you to share your screen and take the floor. So William will be presenting on building on SA's LCA expertise. And to note, you would have seen that we do have a number of our LCA experts in the room, and a way forward for effective LCAs in response to EPR regulations. So William, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. So yes, as mentioned, I'm going to be presenting on behalf of our core LCA team, Valentina Russo and Anton Neyman at the CSIR. We're in the Sustainability, Economics and Waste Research Group, and our broader research interest is in fact extending LCA to incorporate broader sustainability aspects. In other words, to build life cycle sustainability assessment. So today I'm going to be talking about the role of life cycle assessment and extended producer responsibility. That's relatively new legislation. And of course, our knowledge and understanding of this is also a bit confused and quite new. So the outline of the presentation, I'm going to discuss the requirement for LCA in the EPR regulations. Why is there the LCA requirement? Who perhaps is the obliged producer? And how LCA can be particularly used or applied in EPR, producer responsibility schemes. As of course, we need to, so we need to think about how we can expedite the appropriate use of LCA in extended producer responsibility schemes. So firstly, what is EPR and LCA? So extended producer responsibility is essentially a broadening of the environmental policy, which says the polluter should pay. So the polluter or the producer of a certain product should somehow assume full responsibility for the life of their products, including the end-of-life impacts. So the EPR regulations are in fact focusing or covering some of South Africa's so-called problem products, and we're thinking about packaging, electronics, and lighting sector particularly. And I guess there's two statements which come from our current regulations. All producers and producer responsibility organizations must register. And there's a need for these producers or producer responsible organizations, these responsible or obliged companies, shall we say, we'll get into that later, to conduct a life cycle assessment of products within 3 years of implementation of an EPR scheme. So I think this is a moving policy space, and there might be some small changes to that as we go on. So the intent of LCA, as I mentioned, is to somehow broaden the responsibility of producers or manufacturers for their products. So typically EPR, if we look at the product life cycle on the bottom of this diagram here, all the way from raw materials to consumer and end of use. Traditionally, the EPR scheme is really focused on waste management, so extending the responsibility of producers for their products all the way down to management aspects. So I think the intent of the actual inclusion of LCA in EPR is to in fact broaden this, so the upstream aspects of their production. They consider material choice and maybe material alternatives. They consider aspects of reuse and return of, for example, packaging material. So it's all about design and alternatives upstream, which also need to be somehow included into this idea of responsible production. And that, of course, speaks very much to our move towards a more circular economy.
Thank you, William. Just to note, you're breaking up a little bit of time. So maybe if you could switch off your video.
Let's do that.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. So EPR now includes the requirement for LCA, and LCA, of course, is focused on the entire product life cycle. So producers of products need to think about upstream material choice and material design in the actual production. So the exact point at which a company seems to be deemed responsible under EPR is the point essentially where that product is introduced into the market. In other words, I think the overall intent of the EPR is to try and ensure that the market price for a particular product does include many environmental aspects, which are often externalities in that market price. So there essentially needs to be a point, which is typically where that product gets consumed, goes onto the market, where the responsible organization or the points of responsibility lies. And obviously there kind of needs to be a point of responsibility, which will then cascade up the system to avoid unclear responsibility, overlap, double accounting, those type of aspects. So in an overall EPR scheme, there needs to be a point of responsibility, and that's deemed where that product goes onto the market and receives a market price. So of course, you could be an importer of a packaging material, that would still apply. It goes onto the South African market. You could be importing plastic pellets and making your own packaging, that would still apply. Or you could be buying packaging from South African manufacturing, and that would also still apply. So that's my understanding of the actual point of responsibility. So our current legislation, in fact, says it's any person or category of persons or brand owner who is engaged in the commercial manufacture, conversion, refurbishment, or import of new and or used products as identified by the minister. So it sounds quite clear, but it totally doesn't seem that it is. But there is, of course, the single idea that there's a point of production where obviously things are going on the market, and that needs to somehow include the points of responsibility. And of course, the major brand owners, of course, have a very big market share, and one would think about calling to action their role in extended producer responsibility and understanding how they can extend that to include packaging choices, for example, which are included in the regulations. So now for the exact role of LCA, as I think we know already, life cycle assessment is an ISO standard, and it provides a framework for assessment, typically of environmental impacts, understanding the complete life cycle of the product. So that's from material use and extraction all the way to manufacturing, processing, distribution, consumption, or use, and end of life and disposal. So typically LCAs are carried out through understanding environmental aspects, but of course we often want to broaden that environmental life cycle assessment to include other social or socio-economic aspects, particularly jobs, for example, and other aspects related to livelihoods and production. And that would be extending life cycle assessment to life cycle sustainability assessment. So just in terms of environmental life cycle assessment, it's a very analytical, rigorous type of process. It basically simulates industrial production for a given product and delineates its whole value chain. And we rely on a lot of international databases for this type of analysis. So this type of analysis obviously covers a suite of environmental indicators. And many of these indicators have what you can see here in the middle is in midpoint impact categories. So for example, particulate matter, PM10, sooty material in the air would be a midpoint indicator. We actually need to understand, yes, we need to measure it and we know it does harm and it's important to know what that is from the industrial production. But to actually understand what effect it's going to have on ecosystems and human health, we need to understand the actual damage mechanism, damage category. So there's a whole range of environmental impacts which are carried out. A suite of indicators, if you like, are used in typical environmental life cycle assessment. However, of course, what's very notable and has come up several times in the discussion is the lack of an indicator for marine litter or litter of materials or plastics in the environment generally. So this is a notable research gap which many researchers are trying to fill somehow. And it obviously needs an understanding of the amount of materials and their impact pathways in order to actually really incorporate that into a life cycle assessment. So as I mentioned, life cycle assessments typically require very detailed analysis. They essentially look at all the material and energy flows going into a production system and allocate that to a particular given product. So they essentially look at the environmental footprint of a given product. And of course, that is data intensive and it requires a certain expertise in terms of software and databases to model the actual life cycle and to assess and analyze the impacts. So that's available, but to try and expedite life cycle assessments for EPR and to make it really relevant for the South African context, I think it's particularly noticeable that we need a few things. We need, for example, guidelines. So applying LCAs to the South African context, it requires a whole lot of modeling assumptions and data requirements, and many of these can be predefined up front. And in fact, we could go through a process where we start to aggregate similarly type of products or product categories and facilitate the process of looking at all the potentially thousands and thousands of different products which might need LCAs into product categories, which would actually expedite the LCA process. And then, of course, data sources and modeling choices are also very important, and I'll talk about them a bit later within the guidelines. What data should we use and how we should consider allocation and end of life and those things. And of course, there's a need for particularly South African data. So South Africa is a rapidly industrializing, developing country, and it's of course got a different context to industrial production or consumption in other countries. European countries, for example, where a lot of the data sits. In other words, a lot of the eco-invent type of data, which is used for life cycle assessments, is global data or European type of data. So we often need South African type of data. Very key, of course, we also need to understand the actual material flows and the waste management and end of life in the South African context. And we need to use both the established indicators, but also perhaps think about additional ones. And the additional ones, of course, to note are things related to terrestrial and marine litter and plastic pollution in general, or material pollution. But there's also some very important socioeconomic impacts that we would often want to include when we're thinking about waste management. That's around jobs and livelihoods and affordability of different options to the consumer. So we need to think about established indicators and additional ones, perhaps new indicators or impact assessment methods relevant to the local context, ways to streamline the LCA actual tool or application. In other words, one typically uses Simba Pro or OpenLCA or Gabi, some type of licensed software to access databases, which obviously need purchasing in many cases, to carry out this typical inventory that you need to simulate industrial production in order to assess the impacts. So of course, together with that, we need in South Africa some kind of capacity building and mainstreaming of LCA in EPR. In other words, to respond to the EPR regulations, we're seriously going to need an increase in capacity and ability to carry out life cycle assessments in South Africa. So in terms of actual guidelines, there's specific aspects of producing a guideline which could expedite the life cycle assessment as required for extended producer responsibility. So I mentioned before we could come up with certain product categories and certain rules for those product categories. In other words, if your packaging material belongs to this product category, you treat the boundaries and allocation system in a certain way. These are the prescriptive data sets to use, etc., etc. So that can really speed up the actual LCA analysis by having these product categories. And in fact, making the assessment, if you like, more rigorous and more prescriptive in terms of what data should be used and allocation of boundaries is in fact the way that the EU has been developing or trying to essentially harmonize all the different eco-labels and develop a single market for green products. So it's obviously trying to harmonize the different types of assessments by ensuring that people, when they do a life cycle assessment, use similar boundaries, similar data, etc., and have these product category rules in place to facilitate that. So then there's certain aspects of allocation in LCA. When you have multi-product systems in production, you need to allocate your inputs and also your impacts, your environmental burdens, according to the different products coming out of your industrial production system. And there's different ways to do that type of allocation, for example, on mass or energy or financial economic means, and that needs to be defined and prescribed. And similarly, the suite of indicators that we have, there's several different impact assessment methods used in LCA, and there's typically a dozen or more, or up to 19 or so, environmental indicators that one can look at in terms of carrying out the environmental impact assessment. So also in certain cases, we're going to need South African relevant data. So the guidelines could define the particular data sources that could be used. In other words, ideally, we'd obviously want to use all South African data, but it might take quite considerable time to actually get that data into a well-validated and integrated state for this type of assessment. So typically, we're using a mixture of European and South African data. Many of the current databases, for example, EcoInvent, are beginning to incorporate some very important South African relevant data, for example, electricity production and transport fuels, which are coming from coal and sasol, are particularly energy intensive. And those are now in EcoInvent and South African relevant data sets, but other data sets aren't. So we in fact need to be maybe prescriptive in terms of which one should be used. And that maybe speaks to our long-term objectives in terms of what data sources should we be looking for in terms of reducing the gap between the nice to know South African data and the need to know South African data. Then the other aspect of a guideline, which is very important, is to have some kind of standardized end-of-life model. So our waste management system in South Africa is, if you like, a mixture between the developing and developed world, with a large portion of people actually not serviced by regular weekly waste collection systems and somehow making their own plan in terms of waste management. And therefore we need a consolidated and consistent understanding of that end of life. So even though it's very unclear, the details, the accuracy of what happens at the end of life for many materials, we need some common understanding of an end of life model in South Africa. I've mentioned some of the modeling choices before in terms of allocation methods, so that needs to be standardized, as does some of the system boundaries and when system expansion might be needed in life cycle assessment. So that needs to be sort of defined in a guideline. And then, of course, there's often the need to incorporate some type of social aspect into these LCAs. So the life cycle assessment, as I mentioned, is traditionally only the environmental indicators, but of course, in the South African context, there's often a need to report on other socioeconomic benefits or impacts, for example, jobs. So as I mentioned earlier, and Takunda mentioned, there's a need somehow to capture one of the impacts which to date hasn't been incorporated in life cycle assessment, and that's the marine persistence or the marine litter, but also terrestrial litter. So in other words, the persistence of plastic, or in fact any material in the environment, any material coming from our production and consumption systems. So obviously this is a growing concern, similar to our fossil fuel usage. We're seeing accumulating impacts from the consumption of materials, particularly plastics, which we use for single use and everyday items, and in fact take decades, hundreds, perhaps thousands of years to break down in the environment. So the consumption is increasing globally of, for example, plastics, and yet the biodegradation is typically very slow. And it's of course even slower in some of the environments which don't have a lot of microorganisms, for example, the cold marine environment, which has limited oxygen and microbial activity. Plastics are going to break down really slowly, similarly in landfill compared to maybe an aerobic system. So depending on where the material ends up, it's going to remain and persist for some time, depending on its biodegradation rate. So of course, South Africa has been noted as being, in fact, 11th in the world for the mismanagement of plastic waste, with a large proportion leaking into the environment from the mismanagement of its waste systems. And as I mentioned, this is a notable research gap. We somehow need to capture all these effects of plastics on biota, which in fact also includes the slow breakdown of plastics into microplastics, of course, which are having many unseen type of effects on filter feeders and other microorganisms all the way up the food chain. So one thing we've been working on to incorporate into our life cycle assessments is the end-of-life model in South Africa. And the end-of-life model, of course, depends on the particular waste management or mismanagement system. So in South Africa, as Takunda pointed out, a large portion of the population, in fact, don't have access to regular weekly waste collection systems, over a third, in fact. So they make their own plans in terms of open dumps. Quite a large portion of that is in fact burnt. So often a lot of that dump is in fact burnt regularly, but we estimate about only 60% of those open dumps actually burn. And of those mismanaged systems, in other words, often in the rural areas, unserviced people, sometimes in fact on the edges of urban settlements as well, informal settlements, a lot of that waste we estimate perhaps 80% or so, generally speaking, would then leak into the environment. Of course, there's also a considerable amount of waste which gets managed at least fairly well in landfills. So we have two classes of landfills here. A deficient landfill, generally the smaller landfills in the towns and villages, which are designated landfill sites and are managed, but are sometimes a bit deficient in their management in terms of particularly not being covered and adequately to prevent wind-blown litter and leakage from the actual landfill. They, of course, typically don't have a lining in place to prevent infiltration of the groundwater as well. So we estimate perhaps from that, which would capture about 38% of the waste in South Africa, those smaller deficient landfills, perhaps about 30% of that would leak into the environment. And then there's of course the compliant landfills, which are again about 30% of the total. Those compliant landfills are well managed and they cap nicely, reduce wind-blown litter and leakage in many cases, and only about 1% or so leakage would in fact emanate from that system. So this is a general end-of-life waste model that we can utilize and that I think captures our different waste management systems in South Africa. And of course points to a huge portion of the unserviced community, which would have where there's an opportunity for better waste management and obviously improved recycling, etc. So in this leakage model, if you like, we're thinking about total, if we look at waste management in South Africa, 20 or 23%, I think it is, of all the waste might leak into the environment. But of course that needs to be tailored and tempered by the specific type of product that one is looking at. A battery is very unlikely to leak from the landfill and waste management system. into the environment, but maybe a lightweight piece of plastic or polystyrene would have a high likelihood of leaking from our waste management systems. So then, to increase our understanding of the impacts of litter and persistence, materials such as plastic persisting in the environment, we've started to develop this, what I would call a midpoint indicator. So it doesn't reflect the actual impacts that the plastics or materials might have, but it reflects the amount of time that the material remains in the environment. And of course, the understanding is clearly that if the material remains for a long time in the environment, like plastics do often remain in the environment, for example, the marine environment for hundreds of thousands of years, then one would think that the chance of causing harm or the probability of causing harm is greater. But the actual impact pathways in terms of ingestion, strangulation, suffocation, all those impacts, of course, aren't very clear and are very localized to the specific country or context. So in our persistence indicator, we basically use the life cycle assessment end-of-life model and our assumed leakage rates to understand what would actually end up in going into the environment from a certain product. And therefore, the product, if you like, has an end environmental fate. A lot of it leaks to the environment, some is captured in landfill, and some has the opportunity in the well-managed waste management systems for being contained and for the biodegradables being subjected to good contained composting measures. So to understand the end fates and the persistence of a material in the environment, we basically allocate to those different receiving environments a given material in our life cycle, and then carry out simulated modeling, shown here on the right, in terms of degradation. So obviously the degradation is going to depend on the nature of the material, but also on the fate of that material in the receiving environment. So of course, a plastic or a paper bag would degrade a lot longer in marine or landfill compared to if it went through a containment and a dedicated composting facility. So the amount of materials ending up in the different end fates, marine, landfill, and containment and composting, are simulated through laboratory degradation data to get an actual persistence indicator, which reflects the amount of material remaining in the receiving environment after a certain period of time. And we're using that midpoint persistence indicator to try to get a deeper understanding of actual impacts. But of course, it's a proxy for all those environmental impacts we don't fully understand. So in terms of the way forward, in thinking about LCA and how it can be more effectively incorporated into our extended producer responsibility schemes. So as I mentioned, I think there's this need to be more prescriptive and to have guidelines to help expedite the actual life cycle assessment. And that might involve defining product categories where certain products can all be lumped together and a life cycle assessment be carried out almost jointly on that product category. Defining certain allocation or boundaries or data sources within that guideline can greatly facilitate the actual life cycle assessment process. And then of course we need to begin also with these other aspects where we need to think about the South African data that we have and that we need, and specifically about the nice to knows and need to knows in terms of South African data, and start thinking about a pipeline on how we're going to actually get that data and get it into a very validated state where it can be incorporated into these international LCA databases. And I think Pippa is going to talk a bit more about that. So in tandem, of course, we need to build our capability in training and the use of LCA and LCA tools. And together, that'll in fact enable us to carry out the essential assessments. So starting very soon, I think we need to be in a position where we've got some of the key guidelines in place where we can carry out streamlined life cycle assessment on products in order to inform many of these EPR schemes within the next 3 to 5 years. So thank you very much for your attention, everyone. We welcome some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, William, and your expert team for that presentation. It is much appreciated. So I thank you very much for highlighting there the need for coordination. And I think that's something that we need to emphasize, so that's come through as a thread through through the presentations from Llorenç, talking about the need for coordination at the policy level, being clear on our purpose and the implementation of that. And I'm sure Pippa is going to be highlighting the same in her presentation coming up. So we do need to highlight coordination. And William, if you mind putting up your guidelines to expedite LCA for EPR. So I'd love to have that slide up as we invite questions on this particular topic. So I think, and really interesting to see your timelines and see where we can overlap. And in terms of the coordination required, I think it's quite clear from this diagram of the level of coordination required. So we do want to emphasize that although LCAs are required of producers, that there is a coordination required. So we can't have individual producers, whether they're at the converter, brand owner, retailer, and we'll have further discussion of that in this webinar. We can't have individual approaches, because what we might find is there comes a point where the more detailed guidelines are in place and LCAs already conducted become invalid and new LCAs are required. So I think very important to note that. So thank you so much for highlighting that, William, and we really appreciate your recommendations for a way forward. Nick says he's got depressed. Nick, I'm terribly sorry. If we were in person, we could provide at least some coffee and maybe some chocolate or biscuits to help you with that. But I think in terms of the way forward, the next speaker, Dr. Pippa Notten, will also be unpacking what we need and breaking it down even further. So South African data and validation, I think would be one of the next steps, but the guidelines need to be developed in concert with. And as you'll note, Dumisani did say that within 2 years of the EPR schemes being in place, there needs to be a communication from producers to DFFE on their readiness to conduct LCAs. And within 5 years of promulgation, we need to see the LCAs in place. If you consider the timelines, although 5 years in some way can seem quite long, Pippa will highlight what is needed. So there is in some ways a tight timeline, but it is doable within those frameworks as we've discussed as an expert group. And we will see prioritization and cascading. So William did mention product categories, but we would say within those product categories that at the PRO level, at DFFE level, there needs to be prioritization on by whatever metric, by tonnage of packaging placed on the market or by the greatest impact packaging, which was highlighted by Llorenç, focusing on the hotspotting data. So I think there's much to consider, but we have a good framework. We have a good basis. We have LCA experts. We have some South African data already in place, and we will have guidelines and development for this LCA process. So William, I know Harrow's also typing an answer, but in the meanwhile, William, if you would like to comment, are we saying that the persistence impact category that was pioneered for the carrier bag study is only midpoint, and we need to develop endpoint impact category for how the marine terrestrial litter impacts in the environment? So William, please.
Sure, I think given the need for incorporating marine and terrestrial litter into environmental impacts, we need something. So it's obviously not a good understanding of impacts, but I think a persistence type of indicator can very well complement the existing environmental life cycle indicators, for example, which are global warming, eutrophication, marine toxicity, etc. They don't include the actual, often biophysical type of marine and terrestrial litter impacts. So I think we can clearly incorporate that, and it very much speaks to the mismanagement of our waste systems. In other words, that leakage often comes from there and points to a point, if you like, of intervention, which might leverage a lot of benefits in terms of improving recyclability of materials, for example. So yes, I think we should include some kind of persistence. I think we need to work with Takunda and Harrow's team to obviously refine the leakage rate depending on the particular type of product, and incorporate that into a standardized end-of-life model that everyone can use.
Great, thank you so much, William. And I'm just going to take us back to Dumisani's comments at the beginning of our webinar that this is a learning journey that we're going on. So we already have the ability to indicate persistence, so we have that midpoint, and this is a really good place to start. And there are a number of studies and global studies looking to define the impacts further based on the understanding of the biological systems. So thanks so much. Harrow has also commented in the chat. So as an engineer rather than a scientist, Harrow says he's worried about analysis paralysis. So agreed with you, Harrow, let's work with the midpoint that we have. Let's work with the current understanding of how we might quantify impacts, and then we will develop that further, which is the way of all science, I'd like to point out. So thank you so much, William and Valentina and Anton, as the team developing this for the discussions. I think this is a really good basis on which we can have further discussions to kickstart the development of guidelines. So I would particularly highlight any PROs on the call, and Dumisani, of course, you'll be chatting with yourself and your department of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment on a way forward here. But I'd like to introduce our next expert in this star-studded webinar. We have Dr. Pippa Notten from the Greenhouse in UCT. She's a principal consultant and director at the Greenhouse and an expert LCA practitioner with over 15 years experience, primarily relating to life cycle assessment and product environmental footprinting in the food, retail, and consumer goods sectors, as well as primary industries. Her most recent consulting work has been with UNEP, looking at a life cycle approach to address single-use plastic pollution. Pippa's research work is centered on the development of a rigorous approach to the quantification of uncertainty in the information needed to support LCA and the development of life cycle impact assessment indicators relevant to South Africa. Pippa is another one who we could refer to, Prof, in this webinar, is an adjunct associate professor at the University of Cape Town, associated with the Environmental Process and Systems Engineering Group in the Department of Chemical Engineering. So I think no one can say that we don't have the experts with a capital T and E in our webinar today across the full spectrum. Thank you so much, Pippa. Over to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks very much. For some reason, I'm not seeing I haven't shared my, oh, sorry, every time I move, I think I'm moving my slides and I'm trying to find how to, sorry, technical issues.
Here we go.
Okay, I think I haven't shared my video. I will do so for the questions. I think for now, I'm just going to keep it on the slides since I'm seeming to have some technical issues. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here, and I hope I live up to all the experts here, but I share this talk with Harrow, who's been active already, and I hope he'll pitch in as well, and with Lauren from WWFSA. So we're talking about maximizing the value, and I hope this talk somewhat summarizes what we've had already this morning. But because I'm maximizing value also largely around talking around the need for data for the database in South Africa. So I think, this has been covered well today. Llorenç covered certainly an international aspect, the UNEA aspect that I've got there on the right. So really internationally, certainly in Europe, and now also here in South Africa, we're seeing this strong need for life cycle to support decisions with life cycle information. But of course, you can't, in order to do that, to have evidence-based decision-making, we need, we need the evidence, we need the data. So we're seeing this call, but what does that actually mean? How do we go about this? So life cycle assessment has really been made workable with databases. So it's inherently a data-intensive undertaking. And since the 1990s, when it was sort of formalized as a decision support tool, let's say, it really has been supported by an increasing number of databases. And William also went over this. So generally, you deal with, because they're huge data sets, you generally interact with them through a software. So in my blue box here, I've got some of the more common softwares. But in those softwares, you find the databases. So just to make the distinction also that it's generally the softwares bring together the databases, don't necessarily generate the data. So these would be people like EcoInvent. Agribelize is a French, sort of like a French national database, but it's just on food products, and IDEA is a Japanese database. So that's just 3 examples. There are many more. And also just to highlight, I think an interesting one is the environmental footprint database. So I think many people may have heard of PEF, which is product environmental footprint. So the European Commission have this very ambitious undertaking to provide environmental footprints for all products on the European market. And as you know, as we're saying here, you really can't do this without the data. So what this has done is really bring together a large number of existing data providers within life cycle assessment and consultancies working in this sort of thing, really together to provide the data sets that can make this workable. So we have a good example in the European Commission of how this can be done. Yeah, also just to highlight, there's also sector-specific tools. So not only with the softwares, you can also have sort of deep dives or software packages or subsets of a software that really deal with specific sectors. So I've just pulled out 3 examples there for packaging tools. There are even more. And those are also very active in the sort of the building industry. There are a number of building material tools and that. So that's also a way of making LCA quick and workable. So you may say, well, that looks great. There's lots of tools out there for us to use. So why do we feel, or why are we arguing here for a South African database? Why do we need our own data? Well, I think Llorenç mentioned quite strongly that, and showed us some good examples of how much LCAs are context specific. So we really need data that covers South Africa's specific context and needs. And that lack of sort of standardized and quality assured data that one can easily bring together really hampers the uptake of LCA. So if you have the time to hire a consultant, absolutely you can work with the data that's out there, and that's what William was talking about. You can kind of, there's a lot of combining international data, adapting it for South Africa. There are some South African data sets already, but that takes a fair degree of expertise and a fair degree of time. And then time is the most costly aspect of the LCA study. So the more time we take, the more expensive it gets. So if we want to make this, and that, you know, is obviously something that hampers the uptake. So it's a dual, it's about the time of it, and also not only the time, but also having standardized data that really will allow for meaningful value-adding studies in South Africa. So absolutely, we can go and pick some readily available data. We could throw it in one of those packaging tools, but we won't get the insights that are particular to South Africa, and we may miss some important aspects. In fact, we will, having looked at international studies and then done similar studies in South Africa, we do see really interesting differences when we look at the South African context. And on with that also is the more we, national database will grow the skills and capacity in life cycle decision-making, and also just in sort of eco-design. So in having the data to apply will grow the skills, and also in generating a database requires lots of different studies, lots of little LCAs, and that will grow our capacity. And we can already see some example of that from past projects. So moving on. I'm talking lifecycle database all the time, and I thought perhaps it's good to take a quick step back just so that we're all clear on what actually I'm meaning when I'm saying a lifecycle assessment database. So we've heard a lot of definitions of LCA this morning, so I certainly don't need to dwell on this. But a lifecycle assessment is the process. So it's the decision support tool, and it's essentially made up of all this lifecycle data. You need both. It's material and energy flows basically on all those, the processes making up the life cycle of a product. You need material and energy flows on each of those. So that's one of the data aspects. The other data aspect is then we take those material and energy flows and we model the consequences of them on human health, on the health of ecosystems and the availability of resources. And in that way, so that we need data on that as well. So it's also translating those material and energy flows into impacts. And both of those need local context. So we need the material and energy flows on South African processes and also on impacts in South Africa. So we've focused quite a lot on the plastic impacts in South Africa, but it's true for a number of other impacts as well. So not all impacts are global. Something like climate change is a global impact, much easier to model. We have the IPCC really sorting that out for us. But when it comes to something like biodiversity, it's extremely difficult and needs a local context. So when we're talking life cycle database, we're kind of talking these life cycle inventories, which is the material and energy flows. And those are the building blocks of the LCA, of the whole process. And these life cycle inventories get combined, or sort of rolled up, as we say, to make the LCA, which is when you actually go all the way to actually calculating the impacts with the impact assessment models. And that's when you see things like global warming, acidification, eutrophication that that you see as the results of an LCA study. So mostly when I'm talking database, I'm talking about the life cycle inventories, but not only, because you almost need, when we're talking LCA database, it's almost like an information system really, because it also needs to set, there's a lot more going on there. You need to define the methodology, the format of the data, how often it's reviewed, its nomenclature. Importantly, William was talking a lot about guidelines, but it's difficult to almost draw the separation between the guidelines and the data, because you need the guidelines, how you collect the data, how the life cycle inventories are set up, need to talk to the impact assessment method. So we need it also needs to sort of be a decision-making body on what impact assessment methods are relevant. And so you're sure that the data you collect and have in your inventories maps well onto your impact assessment methods. So there's a lot going on than just sets of life cycle data. And I think that's why I wanted to make the distinction between a database, which has all this whole thing about, the methodology. Consistency is so important in a life cycle assessment. So you need to have your inventories all consistent so that they can be rolled up, and consistent with your impact assessment methods, so that you can come out with a high quality LCA. And that's why I've got here at the bottom, the contrast is a dataset library and a data hub. So a dataset library is just a collection of data sets. So you do see some of these, but that doesn't allow you to, it's maybe a first step, but it doesn't allow this consistent interconnection of data sets that's so critical for a seamless LCA. And also to point out the difference between the data hub, and I just wanted to highlight here the GLAD, the Global LCA Data Access Network, which is a UNEP led initiative. And this is a data hub. So a data hub is where you can go and find life cycle data. And this is a great resource. It's only been officially launched a year ago. And already it's got 80,000 data sets. And this has really brought together different providers. A big deal here was to actually get data sets to talk to each other. But for you as a user, you can go and find data sets, but it doesn't tell you, it doesn't help you with integrating those data sets, or tell you whether that, you still have to read up about the data and decide whether it's good for your specific study or whatever. So I'm going quite slowly. So let me move on somewhat. The good thing is hopefully that we don't have to start from scratch when doing an LCA database. Just to briefly mention, we did a project, or we're part of a project to develop a national LCA database roadmap, and that was with UNEP's Life Cycle Initiative and funded by the European Commission. And you can go to that website and watch a little video on the project. So that we were one of 6 countries that did this. And I won't go over this too much because I see I'm really over time, but you can find the report also on that link I had on the previous slide. So as with the roadmap, you define a vision, and then we had our goals to achieve that vision, and then we translate those into 14 objectives, and then we have an implementation plan with short, medium, and longer term activities that need to be undertaken. Also not starting from scratch is that there are some existing South African data sets. So in a former project with Eco-Invent Association, it was the Sustainable Recycling Industries project. That project developed some data sets, and as part of the part of the database roadmaps project, some of those data sets were made available on GLAD. So I invite you to go to either of those websites. If it's too small, please drop me a line and I can send you the links to view those data sets. Now, this is just a picture of the coverage. So they cover electricity and fuels, metals, building materials, freight transport, and agricultural products. But just to note, this is a great starting point, or we hope it's a good starting point, but they don't yet provide that critical mass of consistent data with sufficient coverage. And this is really why we are talking about needing a database. And also a significant problem is they are very much integrated into Eco-Invent. So you actually have to purchase the Eco-Invent database if you really want to work with them. Yeah, so to sum up, sorry, I'm a little bit over time. We really feel to maximize the value of LCA in South Africa would be to have a database that can bring all these aspects together. It's both a wise investment and it will help with making South Africa seamlessly take part in this global movement towards more life cycle data. And importantly, it'll help South Africa's transition to a circular economy and build skills and expertise where it's really needed. But how do we move this forward? That's the $1 million question. So it doesn't end up just as a report on a UNEP website. So I just pulled out the 3 action plans, short-term activities from the action plan. And that was establishing founding partners and establishing champions for the project. And that would be to drive the first design and approval and contracting phase, so design the first phase of the database, and importantly, to decide on an appropriate legal framework, all that sort of thing. And then most important of all, the big elephant in the room is really, well, how do we fund it? So, you know, to secure funding for the design, approval, and contracting phase. So even just if we look at a small amount of funding up front, who could do that? So we really appeal to brand owners, and with the PROs hopefully playing a strong role here as integrators of brand owner contributions, to really see the potential for this to make, you know, so that it's a much wider than just the EPR and with plastics, but the EPR regulations really provide a great motivator to get this moving. And thanks to Kirsten for putting on fabulous webinars like this morning, and the leadership in being willing to take this forward. So please drop Kirsten an email if you do have any action that you could play a part in those 3 activities or more broadly. So thank you. Let me.
Thank you so much, Pippa, much appreciated. I wonder if you could just move back to your last slide.
Sure.
Okay, well, I will talk while you bring it up. So thank you so much. I do want to echo what Pippa was saying in terms of the leadership required here. So please do note that in our EPR regulations, that the requirements to conduct LCA sits with producers. So that currently includes converters, brand owners, importers, and retailers. So the PROs are not legally obligated to conduct LCAs. But I think you would have seen from the very clear evidence needed around the coordination required to have effective LCAs. And we don't want to end up in a place where LCAs are conducted and then become irrelevant. Once we have more effective coordination, we do need coordinated leadership. So we do ask producers on the line, please do be in contact with your PROs and ask them to play a coordinating role. That would then also be a really good funding hub in terms of EPR fees partly being used, and I know there's a lot needed to fund, partly being used to fund the development of our South African database. Do want to emphasize again that this will mean that the time and the costs of developing LCAs will be quite significantly reduced through a South African database. And then all the producers can then access that data in producing their LCAs. This will also make our LCAs more useful when we have LCAs accessing the same South African specific data. We do see that brand owners in terms of the product categories that we're looking for guidelines on. The brand owners would be the point that make the most sense in terms of conducting these LCAs. Brand owners and retailers as your own brand, we do need leadership in this space. Please do be engaging with PROs, registering with DEF, be part of this conversation. And then from there, once we have an idea of product categories, we can then move towards prioritization as we develop the database and the guidelines. I'd like to take this conversation further with our brand owners as well as with our PROs. I don't know if there's anyone else particularly taking the conversation forward. Please do let me know if so we can coordinate our actions. And Valentina noted in the chat, if you, from a producer point of view, here we are highlighting brand owners, please do let us know what you feel needs to be incorporated. Harrow also highlighted that this is not $1 million question that we spoke about funding, but a couple of million rand, which spread across the multiple PROs in the country is definitely doable. And we need, I think we said the timescale, Pippa, being about 2 years to get a sufficient database, or to get the database designed sufficient data to at least start. We do understand databases are developing, but would you say 2 years is sufficient timescale?
I think we said, I mean, I guess it depends how much resources you throw at it, but initially we were planning, I guess, sort of a year on just establishing. So there's a lot around the first part, the sort of how to design, because it's just not just collecting the data. So it would be around designing and we envisaged that being about a year. So I think the R1 million that Harry kind of mentioned there is for that sort of starting phase, when we could certainly take the data we have and test frameworks and things like that with that. But a database is a living entity. And I think almost a database is the wrong word. We almost need a different name for it, because it really would be like the governing body, maybe, was that ambitious of LCA, but it's really around a living thing that would always be needing updating and that. So maybe 2 years to get the first data sets up and running, yes, but certainly an ongoing of then identifying what next to add. Keeping data really quickly goes out of date. So our generation mix, for example, keeps hopefully greening and going towards more renewables, and that needs to be reflected in the LCA data. So it's never a one-off, and I think that's important to note. So part of this design and contracting phase would be, how do you fund it? How does it make it so that it can actually, perhaps it can generate some of its own funding going forward? That's the kind of things that we would be able to get it, but we need that initial kickstart funding, you know, so that you could design that sort of aspect.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think the time is now. So we really need to move on these conversations. And we do know that there are already conversations around PROs coordinating on a number of different aspects of the EPR regulations. So there is currently a hub of discussion which can be engaged with. We are slightly over time. For our attendees, if you can, and our panelists, if you are able to stay online, I think it would be great if we could just answer a question from Michelle. So Harrow's also typing an answer, but Pippa, Michelle asked for use with EPR. Oh, I just lost the answer. So let me go down to the bottom. Or the question, are we likely to arrive on one overall impact score for use with EPR? And if so, how will the various constituent categories be weighted? Specifically concerned about the impact of local manufacture using Eskom, the dirty energy, and local raw materials, for example, Sasol, which are likely to generate high emissions but generate local jobs. So Harrow's already said that we generally advise against single score LCA results, but would you like to add further comments there?
Yeah, I can. I would probably agree with Harrow. I'm not a fan of single score. It is so much simpler though, and it's interesting to see that PEF have actually gone, so that's the European Commission project, they have gone to a single score weighting of the categories through quite a rigorous process, which involves sort of a planetary boundary experts, surveys with European sort of with civil society, with consumers, you know. So it was, I think, 3 sets of weightings that they then combined. So it's as rigorous as you can go, but weighting is always subjective. So that is the kind of thing that could be decided as part of a database. Would you want to go that, and how would you do it? But it would need to be a very rigorous process, taking in various stakeholder views, should you want to go that way. But I would always argue against it, because you lose so much when you, part of an LCA is understanding the trade-offs between some impacts here, other impacts there. And once you roll everything together, you lose that insight, which is really a big part of it. So I would argue against doing it. But also on the aspect of the dirty industry of sasol and stuff, I think as long as everybody in South Africa is using that data, then at least it strongly talks about why we need this level playing field and good consistent data, so that if all people that are doing plastics have the right mix of polymer from sasol in their inventories, then it, in terms of at least between and South African products, it's not a particular factor, but it does need to be that somebody else hasn't used an international data set that doesn't have a sasol data set in it all. So that would be an issue. But of course, that is more of an issue when you're talking about being competitive on international markets. And I think that's where that really starts to play a strong role, as we start to see the weaknesses in our South African products, maybe the carbon risk in our products, and what we need to be addressing. So maybe that's more for the policymakers than the EPR regs.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Pippa. And I think highlighting once again the need for coordination and specific guidelines, and the expert engagement in terms of developing this LCA response to our EPR regulations. Michelle has added a further comment, and I think we're going to hope that it drives action at the policy and national level, and speaks to our energy and material inputs, rather than driving towards importing packaging. So that is under discussion, and what will be built in, as you've mentioned, is a local consideration of jobs. So Harro, you're welcome to have, I think, the last word on this webinar, if you'd like to jump in there. And Harro and Pippa, I'll open that up to both, and then I think we'll end this webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, for that comment that we don't want to drive importing packaging for the wrong reasons to get a better LCA result. Interestingly, that was the assignment in our LCA course to our students last year, to compare the footprint of imported polypropylene, I think it was, to local. And yes, that would be the sort of knee-jerk reaction that one would get out of doing a quick LCA on polymer. But yeah, we have to keep in mind what this really is about, and this is a journey to make our own economy, and specifically our own plastics sector, more circular. And I think William's slides showed very powerfully, that LCA goes both ways. It looks upstream to your supply chain, and we know that's very dirty in South Africa, and it must change. But also, very importantly, and that's where the department's mandate out of the waste management branch sort of comes in, as it looks downstream, and it's there where William's presentation also showed that, and what we heard from Llorenç, that you really need to understand where your product goes in quite some detail in order to do this work properly. What you then want to do is, once you've got the intelligence of where your product goes, is you want to be able to put in a unified description that everybody else uses for what the end of life in South Africa looks like. And so that you can really then make your design for environment and intervention choices based on the life cycle. So, I mean, the last thing we want is people doing the LCA just as a tick box exercise because it's now in the regulations. You want to keep the aim in mind here, to keep our beautiful country free of plastic waste. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harro. Thank you for that comment. Pippa, and invite your last word before we close this webinar.
And also just catching on to what Michelle's point there was about the job aspect as well, and the development, and unfortunately I was rushing there, but certainly when we looked at in our database working group, defined a vision for South African national database, it was very much to the environmental and the socioeconomic aspect. And I think that's absolutely critical and does speak to our specific local context. So we really, one of the aspects, perhaps ambitious, but is to really that we need to include that development aspect in our LCA so that we see the positives and not just an increased emission, you know. So it's very much around bringing in our context, which will always needs to include job creation and addressing inequalities.
Great.
Yeah, I think that was a great point of Harris at the end, is to keep in mind really what the goal, supporting, you know, better environmentals or better sustainable decision making in South Africa, and absolutely not just a tick box exercise.
Great. Thank you so much, Pippa. And thank you once again to all our speakers. And I know, thank you, Claudia, for placing in the chat that we have further developments and a project on the sustainable textile value chain, which obviously has extensive linkages to the plastic sector. So thank you so much. Once again, a call for coordination across the PROs and particularly the producers, with a highlight on brand owners. And please do note that your voice is needed in this conversation. So DFFE have continually emphasized, and sorry, Dumi, if I'm speaking for you, continually emphasized the need for industry to coordinate and to help design the frameworks, given that industry is the expertise base, help design the response and the approach in terms of the EPR regulations. So we really do need that leadership. And I'll be taking certain conversations to that end further. Thank you once again. We really do appreciate your attendance and engagement. We will make this webinar, the presentation, all the links referenced available. We will send it out by email to all attendees. Please feel free to share that beyond this current group. Thank you once again for your time, and all the best, and stay safe.